Welcome to Snooze Stories. Tonight, we travel back, not to a battlefield, not to a throne room, not to the halls of kings or emperors, but to a small village in the Serbian countryside, where a summer storm split the sky open in the middle of the night, and a child came into the world. That child would one day hold lightning in his hands. His name was Nikola Tesla, and his story is one of the strangest, most brilliant, most heartbreaking journeys in the history of human civilization. A man who saw the future so clearly that the present could never quite keep up with him. A man who gave the modern world much of what it runs on and died nearly forgotten, alone in a hotel room with little more than a few notebooks and a pigeon for company. We will follow him from the mountains of what is now Croatia, through the grand laboratories of Europe and America, to the rooftop of a tower on Long Island that was meant to change everything and didn't. We will walk with him through triumph and ruin, through flashes of genius so bright they seemed almost inhuman, and through losses so quiet they are easy to miss if you aren't paying attention. Before we begin, we are a growing community of history enthusiasts, and if you'd like to become a part of it, please subscribe and support us with a like. It helps tremendously in sharing these stories with more people. And if you have a historical figure you'd love to hear about next, let me know in the comments below. Now, Tesla. There is something almost mythological about him, even when you strip away the myths. He was real. The equations were real, the sparks were real, the sleepless nights in the laboratory were real, and so was the loneliness. So was the strange, singular beauty of a mind that could not stop reaching for something just a little further than what the world was ready to receive. This is his story, told slowly, told honestly, told with the care it deserves. Close your eyes if you like. Let the night hold you. We begin in 1856, in a place called Simian, where the mountains meet the sky, and where everything starts. Smiljan is a small place. Even today, it is little more than a handful of houses scattered across a green valley in what is now western Croatia, held on either side by forested hills that rise slowly toward the Velebit Mountains. The air there is clean and cool, the kind of air that makes the world feel very old and very still. In the middle of the 19th century, it was even quieter, a village of farmers and shepherds, of Orthodox priests and seasonal rhythms, of long winters and short summers, and skies that stretched wide and open above the valley floor. It was here, on the 10th of July, 1856, that Nikola Tesla was born. The birth happened just after midnight, in the earliest, darkest hours of the morning, and outside, according to accounts that have been passed down and repeated so many times they have taken on the quality of legend, a thunderstorm was rolling through the valley. Lightning cracked across the hills, rain came down in heavy curtains, and when the midwife finally held the newborn child and announced his arrival to the room, she is said to have called him a child of the storm. His mother, the story goes, looked up and said, "No, a child of the light." Whether those exact words were spoken, we cannot know for certain, but they were remembered. And perhaps what matters is not whether the words are literally true, but what they tell us about the household into which Nikola Tesla was born. A household that understood the difference between darkness and light and believed that the distinction was worth making. His father was Milutin Tesla, a Serbian Orthodox priest. By all accounts, Milutin was a learned man, well-read, eloquent, with a gift for language and a love of literature that he carried alongside his religious duties. He wrote poetry in his spare time. He composed sermons that people remembered. He had a sharp, dry wit, and he was not above making a joke in a room where jokes were unexpected. He was also, in the way of many intellectual fathers, determined that his son would follow him into the church, a determination that would, in time, become one of the central conflicts of Nikola's young life. But it is his mother, Juka Tesla, born Juka Mandic, who captures the attention when you look carefully at the family. Nikola Tesla never learned to read. This is a fact worth sitting with for a moment, not as a mark against her, but as a window into her world. She was a woman of the Serbian countryside in the mid-19th century, the daughter of a family of Orthodox clergy, and formal education for women in that time and place was simply not something that was offered or expected. What she had instead was something harder to measure and perhaps more remarkable: an extraordinary memory, a tireless curiosity, and hands that could not stay still. She made things. From the time she was young, Juka had taught herself to craft useful objects out of whatever materials were available: weaving tools, household implements, small mechanical devices to make the work of the home a little easier. She worked from memory and from instinct, turning problems over in her mind until a solution appeared, and then building it with her hands. She could memorize long, epic poems after a single hearing. She could recite passages from the Bible and from Serbian oral literature with perfect accuracy. Her mind held things, her hands built things. Nikola would later say with complete conviction that everything he was, every gift he had, came from his mother.
The Tesla household in Smiljan was not wealthy, but it was not poor in the ways that matter most. There were books. There were conversations. There was a father who believed in the life of the mind, even as he tried to steer that life in a particular direction. There was a mother who solved problems with her hands and her memory, who never stopped working, who modeled a kind of quiet, relentless ingenuity that her children absorbed without necessarily being able to name it. Nikola was the fourth of 5 children. His siblings were Dane, the eldest son, who was by all accounts exceptionally gifted and who occupied a particular place in the family's hopes; Angelina, Milka, and Marika, his 3 sisters. The family was close, as families in small villages tend to be, bound together by the rhythms of the parish, by the Serbian Orthodox faith that shaped their calendar and their sense of identity, by the particular intimacy of a household where the father was also the spiritual leader of the surrounding community. The valley of Smiljan was beautiful, and it was remote. The nearest town of any real size was Gospic, a few kilometers away. The world beyond the mountains was distant in a way that is difficult to imagine now. News traveled slowly, change came slowly, and the life of the village unfolded at its own pace, governed more by the turning of seasons than by anything happening in the capitals of Europe. And yet, even in this quiet place, the sky was full of electricity. The storms that rolled through the Velebit Mountains in the summer were spectacular, sudden and violent and full of light. They frightened the animals and shook the windows and lit up the hills in great white flashes that left the air smelling of something sharp and clean. For most people in the valley, these storms were simply weather, a fact of life in that landscape, to be endured and waited out. For young Nikola, they were something else entirely. He was drawn to them, not with the simple excitement that many children feel toward thunder and lightning, a kind of thrilled fear, quickly satisfied, but with something deeper and more searching. He wanted to understand what lightning was, where it came from, why it moved the way it moved, why it chose the paths it chose. He would watch from the window of the farmhouse as the storms moved across the valley, and something in him would reach toward the light. He was perhaps 3 or 4 years old the first time he really noticed this in himself, the age when children begin to form questions they cannot yet articulate, the age when the world starts to seem less like a given and more like a puzzle. The puzzle of lightning would stay with him for the rest of his life. There's a photograph of Smiljan, taken much later, long after Tesla had become famous, when people began to make pilgrimages to the village, that shows the old stone church where Milutin Tesla served as priest, and beside it the low farmhouse where the family lived, the hills behind, the open sky above. It is an ordinary place in the best sense of the word, the kind of place where people live close to the earth, where the work is physical and the days are long, where the beauty of the landscape is real but unsentimental. The kind of place that either makes you want to leave very badly or teaches you a patience and a depth that cities cannot quite replicate. For Nikola Tesla, it did both. He would leave, and keep leaving, further and further until the ocean itself was behind him. But something of Smiljan never left him,
something of those storms, something of those hills, something of a mother who built what she needed with her own hands and a father who believed that words and ideas were worth more than almost anything else. He carried all of it, across the mountains, across the sea, into the future that he was already, somehow, beginning to imagine. There are childhoods that look, from the outside, perfectly ordinary and are anything but. Nikola Tesla's early years in Smiljan had the shape of a normal rural upbringing. There were chores and church services, seasons of planting and harvest, the particular rhythms of a priest's household in a small Serbian village. There were siblings to grow up alongside, a mother whose hands were always busy, a father whose voice carried authority and warmth in roughly equal measure. There was the valley, the hills, the sky. But inside that ordinary frame, something was happening that was not ordinary at all. From very early on, earlier than most children begin to show any particular distinction, Nikola Tesla's mind worked differently. Not just quickly, though it was quick. Not just curiously, though it was relentlessly curious. It worked in a way that was, even to the people closest to him, difficult to fully account for. He remembered everything. Not in the loose, approximate way that people sometimes mean when they say they have a good memory, a general sense of events, faces, impressions. Tesla's memory was architectural, precise. He could read a page of text once and recall it word for word weeks later. He could hear a poem or a passage of scripture and carry it in his mind intact, as though it had been written there in permanent ink. His father, who tested him occasionally in the way that intellectual fathers do, was unsettled by it. His mother, who had the same gift, understood it quietly and said little. Languages came to him with unnerving ease. By the time he was a young man, he would speak Serbian, German, French, English, Italian, Czech, and Latin. Not with the labored competence of someone who has studied hard, but with a fluency that suggested the languages had simply arranged themselves inside him without much resistance. But memory, remarkable as it was only part of what set him apart. The other thing, the thing that was harder to explain and that Tesla himself would spend decades trying to describe, were the visions. They began when he was quite young, not dreams exactly. They came when he was awake, sometimes in the middle of ordinary activity, sometimes in the quiet before sleep. Images would appear in front of him, vivid and fully formed, as real to his eye as the furniture in the room or the trees outside the window. At first they frightened him. Flashes of light would accompany them, bright, involuntary, appearing without warning and without apparent cause. He would try to wave them away physically with his hand as though they were insects or smoke. Over time, he learned to live with them, and eventually, much later, he learned to use them, to summon images deliberately, to hold mechanical designs in his mind and rotate them, test them, modify them, all without ever touching a pencil or a piece of paper. He called it a gift in retrospect. In childhood, it felt more like a haunting. He also experienced what we might now recognize as extreme sensory sensitivity. Ordinary stimuli that other people processed without difficulty were, for Tesla, sometimes overwhelming. The ticking of a clock in a quiet room could feel unbearable. A fly landing on his cheek would produce a sensation he described as a kind of thunder. Pearls, in particular, the sight or touch of them, caused him something approaching physical revulsion, a reaction he never fully explained and apparently never lost. He could feel the presence of objects at a distance, or believed he could. He was disturbed by certain vibrations in ways that had no obvious cause. These sensitivities never entirely disappeared. They became, in some ways, the price of admission to a mind that perceived the world with unusual depth and intensity. The same apparatus that made ordinary sounds too loud also made the hum of a wire or the rhythm of a machine into something almost musical, something he could hear and feel and follow into understanding. The farmhouse in Smiljan sat on land that was part farm, part wilderness, a childhood landscape of practical wonder. There were animals, as there always are in such places, and among them was a cat. The cat's name was Machak. Machak was Nikola's cat. in the particular way that certain animals choose a child and make that choice clear to everyone in the household. He was black, or very dark, and he had the sleek indifference of cats generally, except when it came to Nikola, with whom he seemed to have reached some private agreement. Tesla would carry him, stroke his fur, spend long afternoon hours in his company. And then one evening, dry winter air, the kind of cold that makes everything crackle, Nikola ran his hand along Maciek's back and saw it. Sparks. A cascade of tiny blue-white sparks rising from the cat's fur where his hand had passed, visible in the dimness of the room. A soft crackling sound. The hair standing up, the light appearing and disappearing, the whole small spectacle of static electricity that anyone in that room might have dismissed as a curiosity and forgotten by morning. Nikola did not forget it. He ran to his father. He demanded an explanation. What was this? What was the light in the cat's fur? Where did it come from? Was it the same as the lightning in the sky? Milutin Tesla, the priest and the poet, gave what answer he could. Something about nature, about phenomena that were not yet fully understood, about the mysteries that God had placed inside ordinary things. It was probably a gentle and thoughtful answer. It was not enough. Tesla would later identify this moment, this specific evening, this specific cat, as the beginning of everything. The first time the question arrived in its full form, the question that would organize his entire life. What is electricity? Where does it live? What can it do? He was, by his own account, 7 years old. His older brother Dane cast a long shadow over this period of Tesla's childhood, long and complicated. Dane was the firstborn son, and he was, by all family accounts, remarkable. Brilliant, kind, physically graceful. The kind of older sibling who seems to have been assembled with particular care, as though the universe wanted to make clear what human potential looked like when properly arranged. He was the favorite, in the way that oldest children in certain families become favorites, not through any deliberate unfairness, but through the simple gravity of being first, of being the one on whom the family's hopes were most visibly rested. Milutin Tesla had great plans for Dane, and Dane, from everything we know, had the gifts to fulfill them. Then, when Nikola was somewhere around 5 or 6 years old, Dane was killed. The circumstances involve a horse that the family owned, that Dane was riding, or that threw him, or that he fell from. The exact details vary depending on the account, and the accounts themselves are clouded by the grief that settled over the family in the aftermath and never entirely lifted. What is clear is that Dane died suddenly, and that the Tesla household was not the same afterward. Grief does strange things to families. In the Tesla home, it seems to have done what grief often does when a beloved child is lost. It cast a kind of permanent light on the one who was gone. Dane became, in memory, almost impossible to equal. His qualities were preserved in the amber of mourning, fixed and perfect and unreachable. And Nikola, the younger brother, growing up in the wake of that absence, found himself measured, sometimes explicitly, sometimes in the quieter language of sighs and silences, against a ghost. He felt it deeply. Later in life, he would write about it with a candor that suggests the wound never fully healed. He believed, or feared, that his parents' grief for Dane was in some ways greater than anything they felt for him, that his own achievements, however impressive, could not quite fill the shape that his brother's death had left in the family. Whether this was objectively true is impossible to say. Parents carry grief in ways their living children do not always fully see, but it shaped Nikola Tesla's interior life in ways that matter, giving an edge of urgency to his need to prove himself, a particular hunger for recognition that would follow him through all the years ahead, into the laboratories and the lecture halls and the grand, expensive dreams that nobody else could quite see clearly enough to fund. In the meantime, there were experiments. Small ones to begin with, the kind that children conduct without knowing they are conducting them, watching the behavior of water, observing how insects moved, building things with sticks and mud and whatever the farmyard offered. But increasingly, as Nikola grew a little older, the experiments became more purposeful, more structured in the particular way of a mind that was already instinctively working like an engineer. He built a small water wheel from scraps of wood, smooth discs, no paddles, which was wrong by conventional logic, and yet it turned. He designed and constructed a pop gun using a hollowed-out tube and a piston, which worked well enough to alarm the family. He attempted, at one point, to harness the power of June bugs, tying them to a small device he had built and watching with intense focus to see whether their frantic wing beats could generate rotational motion. They could, a little. He was perhaps 9 years old. He had no formal training in mechanics or physics. He had the valley, the farmyard, the storms, his mother's example, and a mind that could not stop asking what would happen if. These were the materials. They were, it would turn out, enough.
At some point, every child who is built for a larger world must leave the valley. For Nikola Tesla, that moment came in stages, each one carrying him a little further from Smiljan, a little closer to the person he was slowly, painfully, brilliantly becoming. The leaving was not clean or triumphant. It was, like most real departures, tangled up with obligation and family expectation, and the particular friction that arises when a gifted child and a loving but determined parent want different things from the same life. But before the leaving, there was Gospic. When Nikola was still young, around 7, the Tesla family moved from Smiljan to the nearby town of Gospic, where Milutin had been assigned to a new parish. Gospic was not a large place, but it was a town rather than a village, and the difference mattered. There were more people, more noise, more of the ordinary texture of civic life, streets and shops, and neighbors whose lives intersected in the particular density of a small urban community. For Nikola, the transition was difficult. The sensory world of Gospic was harder to manage than the open, quieter landscape of Smiljan. The sounds were more numerous and less predictable. The social demands were more constant. He was a child who needed space and stillness to think, and Gospic offered less of both. He attended the local school and performed well. Performing well came naturally to a mind like his, but the years in Gospic have a slightly muted quality in Tesla's own recollections, as though the town never quite became home in the way the valley had been. It was in Gospic, too, that another shadow fell on the family. Dane had died, and now Nikola's father, Milutin, began to focus the full weight of his hopes and his ambitions on his surviving son, which meant, with the particular logic of a devout 19th century father, that Nikola would enter the church. He would study theology. He would become a priest. This had been decided, or at least strongly intended, and the fact that Nikola showed no particular calling for religious life and showed very strong calling for everything else was perhaps not yet fully apparent to Milutin, or perhaps was apparent and simply set aside. The collision between father and son over this question would not happen all at once. It would unfold slowly, over years, gathering force as Nikola's interests became clearer and more urgent and less compatible with the path his father had laid out. But the shape of the conflict was already present, even in these early years in Gospic, in the quiet space between what Milutin wanted and what Nikola was. In 1870, at the age of 14, Nikola was sent to the higher real gymnasium in Karlovac, a school in a town some distance from Gospic, far enough that he lived away from his family for the first time. Karlovac was a revelation. The school was rigorous and well-staffed, with teachers who took the life of the mind seriously. For a boy of Tesla's abilities, it was the first environment that came close to matching what his mind could actually do. He moved through the curriculum at a pace that startled his teachers. Mathematics, which most students found difficult and some found impenetrable, opened itself to him like a familiar landscape. He solved complex problems in his head without writing down the intermediate steps. And when his teachers accused him of cheating, of having memorized the answers rather than working them out, he demonstrated repeatedly and patiently that the work was happening inside him, in the rapid, silent arithmetic of a mind that had simply never needed paper the way other minds did. Physics caught him and held him. There was a physics teacher in Karlovac, Tesla remembered him later with genuine warmth, who performed demonstrations with electrical equipment in the classroom. Simple demonstrations by the standards of the time: static electricity,
basic circuits, small sparks produced by friction and conduction. For most of the students in the room, these were interesting curiosities, mildly diverting moments in an otherwise academic day. For Nikola Tesla, they were something close to religious experience. He watched the sparks and felt the questions rise in him with a force that was almost physical. He stayed after class. He asked questions his teacher struggled to answer. He went home and lay awake thinking about what he had seen. The 4 years in Karlovac were, by any measure, a success. He completed in 4 years what was normally a 6-year course of study. He graduated with results that were, by his teacher's accounts, exceptional in almost every subject. And then he went home to Gospic and nearly died. Cholera arrived in the region in the mid-1870s with the indiscriminate brutality that epidemic disease brings to every community it enters, taking the old, the young, the strong, and the fragile, with no particular interest in who deserved to survive. Tesla contracted it shortly after returning home from Karlovac, and the illness was severe. He was bedridden for months. There were stretches when his survival was genuinely uncertain, and Milutin Tesla sat beside his son's sickbed and prayed with the focused urgency of a man who had already lost one child and could not face losing another. In those long, feverish weeks, a negotiation took place. Nikola, who was 17 and ill, and perhaps more persuasive when horizontal and helpless than he had ever managed to be when healthy, extracted from his father a promise. If he recovered, if he was allowed to live, by whatever grace or luck or divine intervention his father's prayers might secure, he wanted to study engineering. Not theology, not the church, engineering. The real gymnasium had confirmed what the farmyard experiments had suggested. This was what he was for. Milutin, watching his son hover at the edge of survival, agreed. It is one of those moments, quiet, private, unremarked upon by history, that changed everything. A father, exhausted with grief and fear, making a promise to a sick child in a room that smelled of illness. The promise held. When Nikola recovered, slowly and incompletely, he would carry the effects of that illness for years. The argument about his future had been settled, at least in its broad outlines. He would go to the Polytechnic Institute in Graz, in Austria. He would study engineering and physics. He would not become a priest. But before Graz, there was another complication. The Austro-Hungarian military had requirements for young men of Tesla's age, and when the time came for him to report for service, he did not go. Whether this was a deliberate evasion or something more medically justified, his health in the aftermath of cholera was genuinely fragile, is not entirely clear. What is clear is that Milutin Tesla, alarmed by the prospect of his son being conscripted and perhaps sent into danger, sent Nikola into the mountains instead, into the wilderness of the countryside near Smiljan, with instructions to walk, to breathe, to recover. Tesla spent that interlude alone in the mountains, and he would later describe it as one of his most important periods of his life, not for anything that happened externally, but for what happened inside. The solitude and the physical exertion and the clean mountain air did something to him. His health improved. His mind, which had been compressed and overworked and then shattered by illness, began to reassemble itself. He read whatever he could find. He came across the works of Mark Twain in this period, an encounter that produced a joy so intense it apparently helped pull him out of the last depths of his illness, and which led years later to one of the more unlikely friendships of Tesla's remarkable life. He came down from the mountains changed, steadier, more certain of himself. The years of family conflict and illness and deferred ambition had not broken him. They had, if anything, made the hunger sharper. He was ready for Graz. He was ready, though he did not yet know exactly what he was ready for, to meet the idea that would consume the rest of his life.
Graz, in the late 1870s, was a city that took itself seriously. It was the second largest city in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a place of wide boulevards and elegant facades, of coffee houses where students argued about philosophy and politics until the candles burned low, of a university culture that valued precision and rigor and the particular kind of intellectual ambition that flourishes when young people from across a vast empire are gathered together in one place and told, in effect, to think. The Polytechnic Institute sat within this world with a quiet authority, training engineers and scientists for the machinery of a modernizing empire that needed them badly and was beginning to understand just how badly. Nikola Tesla arrived in the autumn of 1875, 19 years old, still carrying some of the physical fragility left behind by his cholera, but mentally as sharp and hungry as he had ever been. He had his father's blessing, reluctant, conditional, secured from a sickbed, and he had the accumulated force of years of deferred curiosity. He had been waiting for this, for a place where the questions he had been carrying since childhood could finally be given the language and the tools they deserved. He threw himself in with a completeness that alarmed everyone around him. In that first year in Graz, Tesla studied with an intensity that was, by any reasonable measure, excessive. He was in the laboratory at 3 in the morning and back again before breakfast. He worked through Sundays. He completed assignments weeks ahead of schedule and then went further, reading beyond the curriculum, chasing connections between disciplines that his professors had not necessarily intended to connect. He wrote home to his father with results that were almost embarrassing in their excellence, grades so high, commendations so effusive from his teachers that Militon Tesla reportedly took the letters to the local bishop to show them off, and the bishop, reading them, quietly warned Militon that such intensity in a young man was not always a sign of health, that it might be burning something up. Militon wrote to his son and asked him to slow down. Nikola did not slow down. He had found for the first time in his life an environment that could absorb what his mind produced, or nearly could. The mathematics was deep enough to hold his attention. The physics was complex enough to resist him slightly, which he needed. There were teachers of genuine quality, and there were fellow students who were serious and able, and there was the city itself, with its coffee houses and its concerts and its particular European atmosphere of ideas taken seriously and pleasure taken seriously in roughly equal measure. He was happy, in the driven, slightly feverish way that very gifted people are sometimes happy when they first find their element. It was in the second year of his studies that the collision happened. The collision was with a machine, specifically with a demonstration of a Grom dynamo that one of his professors, a man named Professor Posch, brought into the classroom. The Grom dynamo was a device that could function either as a generator or a motor, converting mechanical energy into electrical energy or vice versa. It ran on direct current, the form of electricity that was, at that time, the only form anyone had seriously worked with or practically deployed.
Herschel demonstrated the machine with evident pride. It was a fine piece of apparatus, representing the current state of the art in electrical engineering. But it had a flaw that was visible, literally, in operation. The commutator, the component responsible for maintaining the direction of current flow, produced sparks as it ran. Small, persistent sparks at the point of contact between the brushes and the rotating drum. Not dangerous, not unusual. Every commutator of that type sparked. It was simply how the machine worked. Tesla watched those sparks, and something in him, that same something that had watched the sparks in macaque's fur 15 years earlier, that had pressed its face against the classroom window at every electrical demonstration in Karlovac, could not accept them as simply how the machine worked. They seemed wrong, wasteful, inefficient, an imperfection that pointed to a deeper imperfection in the design itself. He said so. In class, in front of Professor Poschel and his fellow students, he said that he believed the commutator was unnecessary, that it should be possible in principle to build a motor that ran on alternating current, a current that changed direction in a regular cycle, and that such a motor would not need the commutator at all and therefore would not spark. Poschel was a good teacher. He gave Tesla's objection its due, and then he explained, carefully and completely, why it was impossible. alternating current changed direction too rapidly. No motor could be made to follow those reversals and produce useful mechanical work. The mathematics did not support it, the physics did not support it, the engineering did not support it. It was, Poschel concluded with the patient finality of a man who knew his field, a perpetual motion scheme, appealing in its simplicity, impossible in its premise. The class moved on. Tesla did not move on. The idea lodged itself in him like a splinter, small, irritating, impossible to ignore. He turned it over in his mind during lectures, during meals, during the long, late hours in the laboratory. He was not yet sure that Poschel was wrong. He was not yet sure of anything except that the question felt alive in a way that dead questions do not feel. It resisted him, it pushed back, and when a problem pushed back against Tesla, he pushed harder. In his third year, something began to fracture. The intensity of his first 2 years had not diminished. If anything, it had increased, feeding on itself in the way that obsessive focus sometimes does when the object of the obsession begins to feel both tantalizingly close and perpetually out of reach. He began to sleep less, to eat irregularly, to spend hours in states that would not quite work and not quite rest, a kind of suspended concentration that the people around him found unsettling to witness. He developed a passion for gambling that appeared seemingly from nowhere and consumed considerable amounts of the money his parents sent for his expenses. He was not gambling for money exactly, or not only. He was gambling in the way that highly analytical minds gamble, for the mathematics of it, for the problem of probability and pattern, for the particular intensity of a game where the stakes are real and the variables are in motion. He knew this about himself, and it did not help him stop. His studies, which had been exemplary, began to slip. Not dramatically, he was still performing well by any normal standard, but by the standard he had set in his first year, the decline was visible. He missed examinations. He lost the academic dean's commendation that had been his in the first year. He wrote home less often. And Milutin Tesla, reading the signs from Gospic, began to worry.
At the end of his third year, Tesla did not return for a fourth. He left Graz without completing his degree, without, in fact, sitting the final examinations that would have secured it. He did not inform his family that he was leaving. He did not, apparently, fully inform himself. The departure had the quality of a collapse more than a decision, an organism shutting down certain functions in order to preserve others. He moved to Maribor, then called Marsburg, a smaller city not far from Graz, and found work of a kind, drafting. He spent time in the town's billiard halls. He lived quietly and rather poorly, in the way of a young man who has lost his forward momentum and is waiting, without quite knowing it, for something to restart him. Milutin Tesla eventually tracked him down. He traveled to Maribor himself, the priest from Gospic, aging now, worn by years of parish work and family loss, and found his son and pleaded with him to come home, to regroup, to try again. It was a painful meeting by any account. Nikola was 24 years old and had nothing to show for 3 years at the Polytechnic Institute except a reputation for brilliance that he had partly squandered. He came home, and in January of 1880, Milutin Tesla died. The father who had argued with him, worried about him, made promises to him in a sick room and traveled to find him in a billiard hall. The father who had wanted a priest and gotten something far stranger and far more consequential was gone. Tesla grieved, and then, because grief and forward motion were the only 2 directions available to him, he left again. The idea of the alternating current motor was still there, still lodged, still unresolved, still waiting for the moment, which was coming, though not yet, when everything would suddenly become clear. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. It lives deeper than tiredness. It settles into the architecture of a person, into the nerves, the senses, the fine and intricate wiring that connects the mind to the body and the body to the world.
It comes from years of pushing too hard against too much resistance, from grief that has not been properly processed, from ambition that has been repeatedly frustrated, from a nervous system that was never quite ordinary to begin with and has finally reached the limit of what it can absorb. Nikola Tesla arrived in Prague in 1880 in this condition. He had come to study at the Charles Ferdinand University with some financial help from relatives who believed in him, or who believed in the memory of his father enough to invest modestly in his surviving son. Prague was magnificent, one of the great cities of Central Europe, full of spires and bridges and the accumulated weight of centuries, a place where the life of the mind had deep roots and serious practitioners. Under other circumstances, Tesla would have thrived there. But his father had just died, and he had arrived without having completed the prerequisite mathematics courses that would allow him to formally enroll in the subjects he actually wanted to study. He attended lectures, sat in on them unofficially, absorbing what he could, but he was not a registered student in the full sense, and the year in Prague had a provisional, untethered quality. He was learning without structure, mourning without ceremony, moving forward without quite knowing what direction forward was. He stayed for less than a year, and then, through the intervention of family connections, he secured a position in Budapest at the Central Telephone Exchange, which was then under construction and about to become one of the more ambitious telecommunications projects in Central Europe. Budapest in 1881 was electric with possibility. The city was in the midst of a transformation, physical, cultural, economic, that was remaking it from a provincial backwire into one of the most dynamic capitals in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The telephone exchange where Tesla found work was part of this transformation. A new technology, a new kind of infrastructure, a new way of imagining what it meant to be a connected city. The work was technical and demanding, and Tesla was good at it. He had the kind of mind that could hold the entire schematic of a system in his head, identify its weaknesses, propose improvements, and implement them faster than his supervisors expected. He improved the equipment. He designed modifications to the amplifiers that made the exchange function better. His superiors noticed. His career appeared at last to be finding a footing. And then his body gave out completely. The breakdown, when it came, was total. It began with the senses. Tesla's lifelong sensitivity to stimulation, the sensitivity he had managed more or less since childhood, suddenly ceased to be manageable. It was as though every dial had been turned to its highest setting and then the knob had been removed. Sound became unbearable. The rumble of a carriage on a cobblestone street, heard from a distance that would have registered as mild background noise to anyone else, landed on Tesla's ears like a physical blow. He claimed, a watch ticking in another room. A fly landing on a table across a space produced a sound like a small thunder. The ordinary noise of a city, which Budapest was generating in considerable quantities, being in the middle of reinventing itself, was a constant assault. Light was worse. Sunlight through a window was blinding in a way that went beyond mere discomfort. He had to draw the curtains and live in dimness. Even the flicker of a lamp was, at its worst, difficult to tolerate. He moved through his days with the careful minimalism of someone navigating a world that had become, without warning, hostile. His heartbeat became something he was intensely, terrifyingly aware of. He could feel the pulse in his wrists, his temples, his chest, feel it with a precision that made each beat seem both extraordinary and alarming. He measured things, he counted things. He became, for a period, convinced that he was dying, that something structural was failing inside him, that the machinery of his body was winding down toward a conclusion he could not prevent. He could not eat properly, he could not sleep, he grew thin. A friend who saw him during this period described him as looking like a man who had been ill for years, gaunt, pale, the eyes too bright, the movements too careful. He was, by any clinical measure, in crisis. There was a friend in Budapest, a man named Antal Szigeti, an engineer, physically strong and practically minded in the way that Tesla in this period was not. Szigeti visited Tesla in his darkened room and made a decision that was simple and probably saved Tesla's life. He got him outside. He took him walking. At first, just short distances, a few blocks, a park nearby, nothing ambitious. Tesla moved through the world like a convalescent, which, in a real sense, he was. But the walks continued. Szigeti was patient and persistent, and Tesla, who had very little left to resist with, went along. The walking became a daily practice. Distances grew. Color began returning very slowly to Tesla's experience of the world. Not the overwhelming, assaultive color of the breakdown's peak, but something gentler and more sustaining. The appetite came back, the sleep, partially. And one evening in the late winter or early spring of 1882, Tesla's own accounts place it around sunset in a park in Budapest, the Wardenclyffe Park near the city center. Something happened. Tesla was walking with Szigeti. He had a book of poetry with him, Goethe's Faust, which he had been reading and reciting from memory during the walks, finding in the rhythm of the verse something that steadied him. He was reciting, Szigeti walking beside him, the sun going down behind the trees. And suddenly, in the middle of a line of Goethe, it came. Not gradually, not as a dawning realization that assembled itself piece by piece over minutes or hours. It came all at once, complete, fully formed, immediate, the way Tesla had always experienced his deepest insights. The rotating magnetic field. He stopped walking. He picked up a stick from the ground and drew in the dirt of the path. Lines, a diagram. The geometry of a motor that would use alternating current, that would generate a rotating magnetic field strong enough to drag a rotor into motion without any physical contact between the stationary and moving parts, without commutators, without sparks. No brushes touching spinning metal, no mechanical switching of current direction, just the invisible, elegant rotation of a field, like water turning a wheel without ever quite touching it. He drew it out completely, the whole thing, in the dirt, with a stick, while Szigeti watched in silence. He told Szigeti what he was looking at. He explained the principle, speaking rapidly, the words coming in a rush, the way they come when a long-locked door is suddenly open. The field rotates, the rotor follows the field. The current reverses at precisely the frequency needed to keep the rotation continuous. No contact, no sparks, no mechanical inefficiency. Szigeti, practical and kind, listened and nodded and looked at the diagram in the dirt and understood enough to understand that something significant had just happened, even if the full dimensions of its significance were not yet visible. Tesla looked at what he had drawn. He had been carrying this problem since he was a second-year student in Graz, when Professor Poschel had explained patiently and completely why it could not be done. He had carried it through the collapse of his studies, through his father's death, through the gray year in Prague, through the long nightmare of the breakdown in Budapest. He had carried it in the wordless, image-rich interior of a mind that worked on problems without necessarily announcing it, turning the question over and over in the dark, in the background, beneath the conscious surface, until the answer was ready. It had taken roughly 6 years. It was, in that dirt path at sunset, already complete. What he had conceived that evening in Budapest was not a minor improvement on existing technology. It was not a refinement or an optimization or a clever workaround. It was a fundamental reconceptualization of how electrical power could be generated, transmitted, and used. Direct current, the electricity of Edison, of the existing infrastructure, of every battery and generator and motor then in operation, flowed in one direction. It was reliable and controllable over short distances. It was also enormously limited. You could not transmit it efficiently over long distances because the resistance of the wire consumed it. To power a city with direct current, you needed generating stations every mile or so. The infrastructure required was massive, expensive, and ultimately finite. Alternating current changed direction in a cycle, back and forth, many times per second. This had been understood theoretically for decades. What had not been understood, what everyone, including the excellent Professor Poschel, had declared impossible, was how to make useful mechanical work from a current that was constantly reversing itself. Tesla's rotating magnetic field answered that question. The implications were staggering, though it would take years and enormous battles before the world began to understand them.
Alternating current, transmitted at high voltage and stepped down by transformers at the point of use, could travel hundreds of miles with acceptable losses. It could power not just lights, which direct current could already do, but motors, factories, railways, cities, the entire apparatus of a modern industrial civilization. He had seen it in an afternoon, on a path in a park in Budapest, reciting Goethe. He was 25 years old. His health was still fragile. He had no laboratory, no funding, no institutional support, no employer willing to invest in what he had conceived. He had a diagram scratched in dirt, which the evening wind was already, probably, beginning to erase. But the idea was safe. The idea was in his mind, which did not erase things. He just needed to find somewhere and someone who would let him build it.
Paris, in the early 1880s, was the brightest city in the world. Not metaphorically, literally. The arc lamps that had begun appearing along the Grand boulevards cast a light so intense and so white that Parisians who saw them for the first time stood in the street and stared, unsure whether to be delighted or unnerved. The city was in the process of being electrified, slowly and expensively and with great fanfare. And the man whose name was attached to this transformation, whose company was doing the wiring, whose system was being installed, whose vision of an electrically illuminated civilization was being tested in real time on the streets of the most glamorous city in Europe, was Thomas Alva Edison. Edison was 35 years old and already a legend. He had invented the phonograph. He had developed a practical incandescent light bulb. He had built in Menlo Park, New Jersey, the world's first industrial research laboratory, a place specifically designed for the systematic production of invention, staffed by engineers and machinists and chemists working under his direction toward goals he set and problems he defined. He had, in other words, not just invented things, but invented a new way of inventing things, and the world had noticed. His direct current electrical system, generators, cables, switches, meters, all designed to work together as an integrated whole, was being installed in cities across Europe and America. The Continental Edison Company, headquartered in Paris, was his European operation, and it was here in 1882 that Nikola Tesla arrived looking for work. He was hired. The Continental Edison Company needed engineers who could think quickly, work long hours, and solve the practical problems that arose when you were trying to install a new and complicated technology in buildings and streets that had been designed without it in mind. Tesla was exactly this kind of engineer, precise, fast, able to hold complex systems in his head, tireless in the way that people are tireless when the work is interesting enough. He began with repairs and improvements to the electrical equipment at various installation sites, hotels, office buildings, the infrastructure of a city being wired for the first time. He was good at it. He was very good at it. Problems that stumped other engineers dissolved when Tesla looked at them because he could see the whole system, not just the component that had failed, but the relationships between components, the flow of current through the entire network, the point at which a small inefficiency upstream was producing a large failure downstream. His supervisors noticed, as supervisors of Tesla tended to do, and gave him more responsibility. He was sent to troubleshoot difficult installations in other cities, Strasbourg at one point, where a new power plant had been built for the opening of a railway station and the electrical system had malfunctioned so badly that the emperor himself, present for the ceremony, had been startled by an explosion. Tesla was dispatched to fix it. He fixed it. He was also, during all of this, carrying his rotating magnetic field. He had not built it. He had not been given the resources or the time or the institutional support to demonstrate it, but he talked about it to colleagues, to supervisors, to anyone who would listen, and the response he received in Paris was consistent and discouraging. People were polite, people acknowledged that it was an interesting idea, and then they explained, as Professor Poschel had explained years earlier, why it would not work. Or they simply changed the subject. There was a man in the Continental Edison organization, Charles Batchelor, an Englishman who had been one of Edison's closest associates in Menlo Park and who now managed the European operations, who was different.
Batchelor watched Tesla work. He asked questions. He understood enough of what Tesla was describing to sense, if not the full dimensions of it, at least that this was not an ordinary engineer making ordinary conversation about ordinary ideas. When Tesla made clear that he wanted to go to America, that he believed the place where his idea might finally find support was not Paris but New York, not the European operation but Edison himself, Batchelor did not discourage him. He wrote Tesla a letter of introduction. The letter, as Tesla later recalled it, was brief and to the point. It said, more or less, "I know of only two great men. You are one of them. The other is this young man." Whether those were the exact words, history cannot confirm. But the letter existed, and it worked. And in the spring of 1884, Nikola Tesla boarded a ship for America. The crossing nearly ended him before he arrived. There was a mutiny among the passengers, or something close to one, a serious disturbance on board that Tesla described as alarming and chaotic. At some point during the voyage, his luggage was stolen, along with much of his money and his ticket. He arrived in New York with 4 cents in his pocket, a book of his own poems, a collection of mathematical calculations, and the letter from Batchelor. He also arrived, by his own account, full of optimism. This requires a moment's attention. A man of 27, arriving alone in a foreign city with almost no money, having just survived a chaotic ocean crossing, carrying an idea that nobody in Europe had been willing to fund or even seriously consider, and he was optimistic. This was not naivety exactly, and it was not performance. It was the particular quality of a mind that was so certain of what it carried that external circumstances could not, at least for now, diminish the certainty. He stepped off the ship and into New York City. New York in 1884 was loud and enormous and slightly overwhelming, even for people who had been expecting it. Tesla had not quite been expecting it. The scale of the city, the density of it, the noise, the sheer number of people moving through streets that were themselves already crammed with horses and carts and early electrical infrastructure, was different from anything in Europe. Different from Paris even, which was grand but coherent. New York had a rawness to it, an unfinished quality, a sense of energy that had not yet been fully organized into elegance. Tesla walked through it on his first day, taking it in, and somewhere in lower Manhattan, according to a story he told later with evident pleasure, he came across a man repairing an electrical motor on the street. He stopped. He looked at the problem. He offered a suggestion. The suggestion worked. The man, impressed, offered him $20 on the spot. He pocketed the money and walked to the Edison Machine Works on Liberty Street.
Thomas Edison received him. The meeting between these two men, which would become one of the most consequential and most fraught relationships in the history of technology, began simply enough. Edison read Batchelor's letter. He looked at Tesla. He asked a few questions in the direct, slightly impatient manner of a man who received many visitors and had learned to assess them quickly. What he saw was a tall, thin young man. Tesla was 6 feet 2 inches, unusually lean, with large hands and eyes that people consistently described as remarkable, pale and intensely focused, the eyes of someone who was always looking at something slightly more than what was in front of them. He spoke English with a European formality that was not yet quite fluent. He was clearly educated. He was clearly capable. Edison hired him. The two men could hardly have been more different. Edison was self-educated, practical to his core, deeply skeptical of theoretical approaches to engineering problems. His method was empirical. Try everything, keep what works, discard what doesn't, document the results. He famously described genius as 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, and he meant it literally. The laboratory at Menlo Park had been built on the principle that invention was a form of industrial production, that if you employed enough smart people and subjected them to enough systematic effort, useful results would emerge with something approaching regularity. He also had a profound, almost personal commitment to direct current.
His entire business, his generators, his cables, his meters, his light bulbs, the whole integrated system he had spent years developing and was now selling across 2 continents, ran on direct current. It was his system. He had built it from the ground up. Its success was his success, and its failure would be his failure. Tesla understood this. He understood it well enough to know that what he was carrying in his head, the rotating magnetic field, the alternating current motor, the vision of a fundamentally different electrical system, was not something he could simply place on Edison's desk and expect to be welcomed. So he did not, at first, say much about it. He worked. He fixed problems. He improved equipment. He did what Tesla always did when he arrived somewhere new. He made himself indispensable as quickly as possible, and he waited for the right moment. The right moment, it turned out, was not coming. Not here. Not with this man. But Tesla did not yet know that. In the late spring of 1884, in the Edison Machine Works on Liberty Street in Lower Manhattan, he was simply a new employee, brilliant, quiet, carrying a secret that would eventually split the world of electrical engineering in 2. He wound his first American coil. He went back to work.
There's a particular kind of workplace dynamic that develops when a very gifted person works for a very gifted person, and neither of them is quite willing to fully acknowledge what the other is. Tesla and Edison circled each other in the Edison Machine Works with a mutual respect that was real but limited. Limited on Edison's side by the practical demands of running a rapidly expanding electrical business, and limited on Tesla's side by the growing awareness that the man he was working for was not going to be the man who helped him build what he had conceived in the park in Budapest. But for a while, the work itself was enough to hold them together. Edison gave Tesla some of the most difficult problems the company faced. This was, in its way, a form of respect, the respect that a hard-driving employer shows to an employee he's quickly identified as exceptional. The problems Edison assigned were not routine maintenance or standard installation work. They were the kind of problems that had stumped other engineers, that had sat on desks accumulating paper and producing no solutions, that required not just competence but genuine creative thinking. Tesla solved them, one after another, with a consistency that impressed even the men at the Machine Works who were themselves very good at what they did. He redesigned arc lighting systems that had been producing unreliable results. He worked on improvements to the dynamos, the generators that were the heart of the Edison system, addressing inefficiencies in their design that had been accepted as unavoidable because nobody had yet figured out how to avoid them. He worked at the pace he always worked at, which is to say, at a pace that other people found difficult to watch without feeling inadequate. He arrived early, he stayed late, very late. He ate when he remembered to eat, which was not always. He brought to the Edison Machine Works the same quality of focused, relentless attention he had brought to every technical problem since childhood, and the results accumulated quickly. And at some point, the timing is not precisely documented, but it was within the first months of his employment, someone, or perhaps Edison himself, made Nikola Tesla a promise. The promise was about the dynamos. Edison's generators were good, but they could be better. The winding patterns, the field configurations, the mechanical arrangements, there was room for significant improvement, and Tesla believed he could see exactly where and how the improvements should be made. It was the kind of comprehensive redesign that required not just fixing individual components, but rethinking the relationships between them. The kind of systemic thinking that Tesla did naturally, and that most engineers of the time did not. He proposed the redesign. He laid out what he intended to do and how he intended to do it, and the response, from Edison or from a senior manager speaking for Edison, depending on which account you follow, was encouraging. If you accomplish this, Tesla was told, there will be $50,000 in it for you. $50,000 in 1884 was an extraordinary sum. It was the kind of money that could fund years of independent research. It was the kind of money that could build a laboratory. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of money that would allow Tesla to stop working for someone else and start building what he actually wanted to build. He accepted the terms and went to work.
What followed was approximately a year of effort that was, by any objective measure, a remarkable achievement. Tesla redesigned 24 different types of standard Edison machines, generators and motors, the workhorses of the Edison electrical system. He improved their efficiency. He improved their reliability. He addressed the mechanical and electromagnetic problems that had been limiting their performance. He did not merely tinker, he rebuilt from the principles outward, and when the work was complete, the machines ran better by every measurable standard. The engineers at the machine works knew what had been accomplished. The improvement was visible in the performance data, audible in the quieter running of the redesigned machines, demonstrable to anyone who compared the before and after in any systematic way. Tesla went to collect. He found Edison. He reminded him of the promise, the $50,000. The redesign had been completed. The machines were better. The terms had been met. Edison looked at him, and then, with the particular directness that was one of his least appealing qualities, Edison told Tesla that he had been joking. That was American humor, Edison said, or words to that effect. You don't understand our American humor. It is worth pausing here in this moment and feeling the full weight of it. Tesla had worked for nearly a year on a project of genuine technical difficulty. He had delivered results that improved a major commercial product. He had been operating under the explicit understanding, whether the promise was made carelessly or deliberately, whether Edison had intended it seriously or as a motivational device or as a joke he forgot he'd made, that there was a specific financial reward attached to the work. He had planned around that reward. He had, in the privacy of his own mind, already begun to see the path it would open. And now he was being told it had been a joke. The damage was not only financial, it was something more fundamental, a damage to the basic operating assumption that agreements meant what they said, that work honestly done would be honestly rewarded, that the world would treat him with the fairness he brought to it. Tesla had come to America full of optimism. He had found in the Edison Machine Works a place that had seemed to value what he could do. He had given it a year of his best work. And this was what the year had produced. He asked Edison quietly for a raise instead. He was earning $18 a week. He asked for $25. Edison said no. Tesla resigned. He left the Edison Machine Works in the spring of 1885, and with his departure, the first chapter of his American life closed, not with a triumph or a transformation, but with a quiet, furious dignity that was, perhaps, more characteristic of the man than any triumph would have been. He had learned something important in that year, though the cost of the lesson was high. He had learned that Edison was not an ally, was not, could not be, someone who would help him build the world he saw. The two men were not merely different in temperament or background or working method. They were, in the deepest sense, building toward incompatible futures. Edison's future ran on direct current. Tesla's future ran on alternating current. These were not just different technologies, they were different visions of what electrical civilization would look like, how it would be organized, who would control it, and what it could ultimately do. The conflict between those visions was coming. Neither man had fully named it yet, but it was coming, and it would shape both of their lives in ways that neither of them, standing in that moment of rupture in the spring of 1885, could entirely foresee.
Edison, for his part, never fully acknowledged what he had lost when Tesla walked out. He had, in the man he let go, someone who understood electricity at a level that was genuinely rare, not just technically competent, not just hard-working, but possessed of a theoretical depth and an intuitive grasp of electromagnetic phenomena that were, in the mid-1880s, essentially unmatched. The improvements to the dynamos were real. The value they added to the Edison business was real, and the mind that had produced them was now, as of the spring of 1885, no longer available to the Edison organization. Edison's response to alternating current, to the technology that Tesla was carrying and that would, within a decade, defeat direct current in the marketplace and in the engineering literature and in the practical wiring of the world,
became over time one of the stranger chapters in the history of invention. He knew what alternating current was. He understood its theoretical advantages. He chose, for reasons that mixed genuine technical skepticism with obvious commercial self-interest, to oppose it, loudly, persistently, and in ways that would eventually do serious damage to his own legacy. But all of that was still ahead. In the spring of 1885, the war had not yet formally begun. There had been a battle, private, unremarked, contained within the walls of the machine works, and Tesla had lost it, in the narrow sense that he had left without the money and without the recognition he had earned. But he had left, and leaving was its own kind of victory, though it did not feel like one yet. What followed the resignation was a period that Tesla, in his later autobiographical writings, described with a brevity that suggests it was too painful to dwell on at length. He had been approached, while still at Edison, by a group of investors who were interested in arc lighting, a different application of electrical technology, less theoretically interesting than alternating current, but commercially viable and relatively straightforward. They wanted Tesla's expertise. They offered him a company, the Tesla Electric and Manufacturing Company, and the promise that he would be able to develop his own ideas within it. He accepted, and for a while, it seemed like the beginning of something. He designed an arc lighting system. It worked well. The investors were pleased. The business appeared to be functioning. And then the investors, having extracted from Tesla the technical expertise they needed, reorganized the company in a way that left Tesla with nothing. No stake, no laboratory, no access to the patents he had filed. They had gotten what they came for, and what they had come for was the knowledge in his head, not the man himself or his future ideas, or his alternating current motor that they had probably never quite understood when he tried to explain it. He was left with a handful of worthless stock certificates. He was 29 years old, in a foreign country, with no employer, no savings, no laboratory, and no immediate prospect of any of these things. The next chapter of his life would begin not in a laboratory or an office, but in a ditch. Literally.
There is no dignified way to describe what happened next. Nikola Tesla, the man who had redesigned 24 types of Edison generators, who had conceived the rotating magnetic field in a park in Budapest, who had crossed an ocean with a letter that said he was one of only 2 great men alive, spent the winter of 1886 digging ditches in the streets of New York City. It was manual labor, hard, cold, physical labor of the kind that has nothing to do with equations or electromagnetic fields or the future of civilization. He worked with a crew of other men, mostly immigrants like himself, breaking ground and laying conduit for electrical cables, ironically for the Edison system, the very system he had left behind. The city was being wired, and the wiring required trenches, and the trenches required men willing to dig them, and Tesla was willing, because there was nothing else available, and rent required money, and money required work, and this was work. He was 30 years old. He would later describe this period in careful, controlled language, the language of a man summarizing an experience he had filed away under necessary suffering and moved past. He mentioned the physical difficulty. He mentioned the foreman, a man he remembered as decent enough. He mentioned the cold. And then, almost always, he moved quickly to what came next, as though the months of ditch digging were a corridor he had passed through rather than a room he had inhabited. But it is worth staying in that corridor for a moment, because what Tesla experienced in those months was not just poverty or physical hardship. It was a specific kind of humiliation that carries its own particular weight. The humiliation of a gifted person doing work that makes no use of their gifts, surrounded by a world that has no immediate interest in what they actually have to offer. He carried the alternating current motor in his head every day. He carried the equations, the diagrams, the vision of what it could do, and every day he went out and dug. There is something in this that matters for understanding the man he became afterward. The Tesla who emerged from this period had a quality, a certain urgency, a certain unwillingness to waste time on anything that wasn't moving toward the goal that the earlier Tesla, the student in Graz, the optimistic immigrant stepping off the ship, did not quite have.
The ditch digging did not break him, but it left a mark. It made the stakes feel real in a way that theoretical deprivation never quite does. The turn came through a foreman. The exact sequence of events is not entirely clear from the historical record. Tesla's own account is slightly vague on the details, in the way of someone recounting a period they would rather not examine too closely. But at some point in 1886, the foreman who supervised Tesla's work crew mentioned him to a man named A.K. Brown, who worked for the Western Union Telegraph Company. Brown was the kind of person who existed at the intersection of money and technical curiosity, not an engineer himself, but someone who understood enough about electrical technology to recognize when something unusual was being described. He met with Tesla. He listened. Tesla explained the rotating magnetic field, the alternating current motor, the principle of the rotating magnetic field, what it could do, and why it was different from everything that currently existed. Brown understood enough to be interested. He brought in a partner, another investor with capital and appetite for risk, and together, in April of 1887, they did what nobody had done for Tesla yet. They gave him a laboratory.
The Tesla Electric Company, which was what they called the new venture, was located on Liberty Street in Lower Manhattan, not far from where the Edison Machine Works had stood. The laboratory was modest by the standards of what Tesla would later build, but it was real. Workbenches and tools and wire and the fundamental equipment of experimental electrical engineering. It was a place where things could be built. Tesla built things. With a speed and focus that his two investors found both impressive and slightly alarming, he worked through the practical realization of everything he had been carrying in his head for 6 years. The rotating magnetic field had been conceived in Budapest in 1882. It had lived, since then, entirely in his mind, refined, extended, turned over from every angle, but never tested against physical reality. Now it met physical reality, and it worked. The motor he built in that laboratory on Liberty Street was not elegant. It was a first prototype, functional rather than refined, built to prove the principle rather than optimize the performance. But it ran. It ran on alternating current. It generated a rotating magnetic field. The rotor followed the field smoothly and continuously, without commutators, without sparks, without the mechanical complexity that had made direct current motors temperamental and limited. It ran exactly as he had seen it in the dirt path in Budapest, in the last light of a winter afternoon, reciting Goethe with a stick in his hand. The patents came quickly. Between 1887 and 1888, Tesla filed a series of patent applications that were, in their totality, one of the most comprehensive and carefully constructed patent portfolios in the history of electrical engineering. He was not naive. The experience with the arc lighting investors had taught him, at significant cost, what happened when the ideas in your head were not protected by legal instruments you actually controlled. He filed for the motors. He filed for the generators. He filed for the transformers and the transmission systems. He filed for the polyphase system, the use of multiple alternating currents, slightly offset in their timing, that allowed for smoother and more efficient power transmission than a single alternating current could provide. He covered the territory with a thoroughness that reflected both his technical understanding of its dimensions and his hard-won awareness of how easily it could be taken from him. The patents were granted. 24 of them, in a cluster that represented the complete architecture of an alternating current electrical system: generation, transmission, distribution, and use. He had the laboratory, the working motor, and the patents. What he needed now was someone with the resources to build it at scale. On the 16th of May, 1888, Nikola Tesla walked into the lecture hall of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers in New York and delivered a paper. The paper was titled, with the precise technical sobriety that characterized Tesla's formal writing, "A New System of Alternate Current Motors and Transformers." He stood at the front of the room, tall and composed, and he explained what he had built and how it worked and what it meant. He used diagrams. He used mathematics. He was clear and systematic, and for those in the room who had the background to follow the argument, completely persuasive. The room contained some of the most capable electrical engineers in America. Several of them understood immediately what they were hearing.
One of the men who understood was an agent working for George Westinghouse.
George Westinghouse was 41 years old, a Pittsburgh industrialist who had made his first fortune with the railway air brake, a safety device he had invented and commercialized in his 20s that had transformed the railroad industry. He was now building an electrical business, and he had already committed, in a way that Edison had not, to alternating current as the technology of the future. He had been working with alternating current systems, primarily for lighting, but he did not yet have an alternating current motor. Without a motor, the system could illuminate buildings, but could not power the machinery of industry, could not do, in other words, the larger work that would make electrical power the foundation of a modern economy. Tesla had the motor. Tesla had the patents, and Tesla had just given a lecture that made both of these facts clear to everyone in the room, including the man who had come specifically to assess him. Westinghouse moved quickly. He sent his people to meet Tesla. Negotiations were brief. Tesla wanted resources more than money, wanted a laboratory and support and the chance to build, and Westinghouse provided the offer that made this possible. The terms included a licensing fee for the patents, a royalty per horsepower of electrical capacity sold using Tesla's system, and a position at the Westinghouse laboratories in Pittsburgh. Tesla accepted. He arrived in Pittsburgh in 1888 and found, for the first time in his American life, an organization that was genuinely committed to what he was trying to do. Westinghouse himself was not always easy. He was a businessman as well as an engineer, and the demands of commerce sometimes pulled in directions that Tesla found frustrating. There were technical disagreements about the frequency at which the alternating current system should operate, disagreements that mattered enormously for the practical performance of the motors, and that Tesla argued with a tenacity that occasionally strained the working relationship. But the work proceeded. The system was being built. The patents were being developed into real, deployable technology. And out in the wider world, the man who had told Tesla that $50,000 was an American joke was beginning to understand what he had let walk out of his machine works on that quiet spring morning 3 years earlier. Edison was paying attention now. The war, the real war, was about to begin.
Wars are rarely fought only on the battlefield. They're fought in newspapers and lecture halls, in courtrooms and corporate boardrooms, in the minds of people who have not yet decided which side they are on, and whose decision will determine the outcome. The war between direct and alternating current, between Edison and Westinghouse, between the past and the future of electrical civilization, was fought in all of these places simultaneously. And it was fought with a ferocity that surprised even the people conducting it. Edison understood by 1888 that he was in a fight. He had spent years and millions of dollars building the infrastructure of a direct current world. He had wired Lower Manhattan. He had installed generating stations in cities across America and Europe. He had built a business empire on the assumption that his system was not just the first electrical system, but the only viable one. That the advantages of direct current were so fundamental and so obvious that no serious alternative could emerge. And now a serious alternative had emerged. It had 24 patents behind it, a wealthy and capable industrialist backing it, and a paper delivered to the American Institute of Electrical Engineers that had made its technical case with a clarity that was difficult to dismiss. Edison's response was to make people afraid. The campaign he launched against alternating current was, by any measure, one of the more remarkable episodes in the history of American business. He began writing and speaking publicly about the dangers of alternating current, its high voltages, its potential for lethal shock, its fundamental unsuitability for use in populated areas. Some of these concerns were not entirely without foundation. High-voltage alternating current was genuinely dangerous if handled improperly, as any high-voltage system is. But Edison presented the danger not as a manageable engineering challenge, but as an inherent and inescapable property of the technology itself, as though alternating current were not simply a different electrical system, but a kind of organized catastrophe waiting to happen.
He commissioned, or at least supported, a series of public demonstrations in which animals, dogs, calves, and eventually a horse, were killed using alternating current generators. The demonstrations were held in West Orange, New Jersey, near his laboratory, and they were attended by journalists who wrote about them and members of the public who came to watch. The message was explicit. This is what alternating current does. This is the technology that Westinghouse wants to put in your home. A young engineer in Edison's employ named Harold Brown became the public face of this campaign, though the resources and the encouragement behind it came from Edison's organization. Brown traveled, demonstrated, argued. He was relentless, and he was effective, at least in the short term, at generating public anxiety about alternating current. The campaign reached its darkest point when the state of New York, looking for a more humane method of execution than hanging, decided to adopt electrocution. Brown worked to ensure that the generator used for the first electric chair, the chair used to execute a convicted murderer named William Kemmler in 1890, was an alternating current machine. He wanted the association in the public mind to be permanent. Alternating current was the killing current. Edison even proposed, with an apparent seriousness that is difficult to read even now, that electrocution by alternating current should be called being Westinghoused. Westinghouse was appalled. Tesla was appalled. The execution of Kemmler was, by contemporary accounts, botched and prolonged, ugly in a way that neither side of the argument wanted to be associated with. The publicity it generated helped nobody's cause cleanly. But the war continued.
Tesla himself was not a natural warrior. He was too private, too invested in the work itself, too fundamentally uninterested in the kind of public combat that Edison seemed to find energizing. He gave lectures, he wrote papers, he demonstrated his motors and his generators to audiences of engineers and scientists and invited guests, and he did this with a precision and a theatrical flair. He was a gifted demonstrator with a natural sense of how to make complicated phenomena visible and comprehensible that won admiration from everyone who saw him. But he did not write polemics. He did not campaign in newspapers. He did not, by temperament or by choice, meet Edison in the specific arena where Edison was most comfortable, the arena of public persuasion and commercial combat. What he did instead was build things. And the things he built spoke more clearly than any newspaper campaign could. The first great test came in 1893 at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The fair had been conceived as a celebration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas, and it had grown into something considerably grander than a celebration. A statement in marble and steel and glass and light of what American civilization had become and what it intended to become next. The planners wanted it to be spectacular. They wanted it to be, in the most literal sense, illuminated, lit up at night in a way that no event of its kind had ever been lit before. The contract to electrify the fair was put out to competitive bid. Edison's organization bid on it. Westinghouse bid on it. The numbers were large. The fair required a quantity of electrical power that was, at the time, almost unprecedented, and the competition was serious. Edison's bid came in higher than Westinghouse's, partly because the cost of copper for direct current systems at that scale was very great, and partly because Westinghouse was willing to price aggressively to win a contract that he understood was about more than money. Westinghouse won. And on the 1st of May, 1893, President Grover Cleveland pressed a button, and 100,000 incandescent light bulbs came on simultaneously, and the World's Columbian Exposition became the White City, a name it earned from the white stucco of its buildings and the white light of its illumination, flooding out across the fairgrounds and the lake and into the darkness of the Chicago night. It was, for most of the people who saw it, the most extraordinary thing they had ever witnessed. The fair ran for 6 months.
It attracted more than 27 million visitors, a number that represented, at the time, roughly half the population of the United States. They came from every state, from Europe, from as far as the technology of travel could bring them. They walked through the fairgrounds at night, and they saw, many of them for the first time in their lives, what electrical illumination actually looked like at scale. Not the dim and flickering gaslight they knew, not the harsh and limited arc lamps of city streets, but something warm and steady and seemingly inexhaustible. Tesla was present at the fair, and he demonstrated. He set up equipment in the Westinghouse pavilion, and he showed what alternating current could do, not just illuminate, but power. Motors running, systems operating, the full range of the technology laid out in working form for anyone who cared to look. He passed high-frequency alternating current through his own body to light bulbs he held in his hands, demonstrating that at the right frequency, the current was not the killing thing that Edison's campaign had insisted it was, but something that could be managed and directed and made to do precise and useful work. He was, by every account, a sensation. The crowds who came to the Westinghouse pavilion left with a different understanding of what electricity was and what it could do than they had arrived with. They left with Tesla's name in their heads, many of them hearing it for the first time, most of them not forgetting it. The war of currents was not over, but the balance had shifted. And then came Niagara Falls. The idea of using the enormous power of Niagara Falls to generate electrical energy was not new. Engineers and entrepreneurs had been thinking about it for decades, sketching proposals and running numbers, and imagining what it would mean to harness one of the great natural forces of the continent. The falls dropped roughly 50 meters, with a volume of water that was, by any calculation, an almost incomprehensible reservoir of mechanical energy. The question had always been not whether it could be done, but how. In 1890, a syndicate of investors, the Cataract Construction Company, backed by some of the most significant financial names in America, including J.P. Morgan and the Vanderbilt family, commissioned a formal study. They brought in an international commission of engineers to evaluate the technical options and recommend an approach. The commission deliberated for years. They invited proposals from Edison's organization. They invited proposals from Westinghouse. They consulted with the leading electrical engineers of Europe and America. And they sat with the fundamental question that the war of currents had made unavoidable: direct current or alternating current, the old system or the new one. The power generated at Niagara Falls needed to be transmitted to Buffalo, 20 miles away. 20 miles was, for direct current at the voltages and conductor sizes that were economically feasible, essentially impossible. The losses in the wire would consume most of the power before it arrived. Alternating current, stepped up to high voltage for transmission and stepped down again at the destination, could make the journey. In 1893, the same year as the World's Fair, the Commission awarded the contract to Westinghouse. Tesla's system would power Niagara Falls. The construction took 3 years. It was an engineering project of enormous complexity. Tunnels carved through rock beneath the falls, turbines of a size that had never been built before. Generators designed to Tesla's specifications, producing alternating current at a scale the world had not yet seen. Thousands of workers, millions of dollars, the kind of effort that requires not just technical competence, but organizational will. The sustained commitment of many people to a single, complicated goal over a long period of time. Tesla visited the site during construction. He stood at the edge of the falls and looked at the water and felt, by his own account, something that was difficult to articulate, a sense of completion, perhaps, or of rightness. He had imagined, as a child in Smiljan, harnessing the power of Niagara Falls. He had told his uncle this, apparently, with the earnestness of a boy who did not yet know the distance between imagining something and doing it. The distance had turned out to be roughly 30 years. On the 16th of November, 1896, the switch was thrown, and power from Niagara Falls traveled 20 miles through copper wire to the city of Buffalo, New York. The lights came on, the motors turned, the city ran on alternating current generated by water falling over rock, transmitted through a system that Nikola Tesla had conceived in the dirt of a Budapest park 14 years earlier. The war of currents was, effectively, over. It did not end with a declaration or a ceremony. It ended the way most technological transitions end. Gradually, then all at once, as the evidence accumulated beyond the point where any reasonable person could dispute it. City after city, country after country, the infrastructure of electrical civilization was built on alternating current. The transformers and the motors and the polyphase generators, all of it Teslas, all of it Westinghouses, all of it running on the principle of the rotating magnetic field that a 25-year-old man had drawn in the dirt with a stick at sunset. Edison never fully conceded. He maintained, publicly and privately, a skepticism about alternating current that hardened over time into something that looked less like a technical position and more like a personal grievance. In 1928, near the end of his life, he told a reporter that the greatest mistake he ever made was not having adopted alternating current when he had the chance. Whether he actually said it or whether the story is apocryphal is debated, but the sentiment, whoever it belongs to, has the ring of truth. Tesla, for his part, did something quietly remarkable in the aftermath of the Westinghouse victory. Westinghouse, whose business had been under severe financial pressure during the years of the War of Currents, came to Tesla and explained honestly that the royalty agreement, the payment per horsepower that was the foundation of Tesla's compensation, was threatening to bankrupt the company. The accumulated royalties, if paid in full, would consume resources that Westinghouse needed to survive. He asked Tesla to consider releasing him from the agreement. Tesla did not hesitate. He tore up the contract. He walked away from what would have amounted in the years ahead to $12 million. He said that Westinghouse had believed in him when nobody else had. That was worth more than the money. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not because it was wrong. He never seemed to think it was wrong. But because the money, had he kept it, might have given him something that proved in time to be the one thing he could never quite secure: the freedom to build what he imagined next.
There is a particular kind of fame that arrives not gradually but all at once, that descends on a person like weather, sudden and total, changing the atmosphere around them in ways they did not fully anticipate and cannot entirely control. This is the kind of fame that found Nikola Tesla in the early 1890s. He had been known before within the specific world of electrical engineering, known as the man behind the alternating current patents, the man whose system had lit the World's Fair, the man whose name was attached to the Niagara Project. But this was a professional reputation, circulating among people who understood what the patents meant and why the Niagara contract mattered. It was the recognition of experts, which is real but contained. What happened after the World's Fair and the Niagara announcement was different. Tesla became famous in the broader sense, the sense in which fame reaches people who have never thought carefully about electrical engineering and never intend to, who know his name not because they have read his papers, but because it is in the newspapers, in the conversation at dinner parties, in the particular cultural atmosphere of a decade that was becoming increasingly aware that the world was being remade, and that the remaking was being done by a handful of extraordinary individuals. He was, by the mid-1890s, one of the most celebrated men in America. The laboratory that Tesla established on South Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, later, after the street was renamed, on what would become West Broadway, was where the next chapter of his life was written. It was not a large space by the standards of what he imagined doing in it. 2 floors of a building in lower Manhattan fitted out with the equipment of a serious experimental physicist: coils, capacitors, transformers, vacuum tubes, high-frequency generators, and the various specialized instruments that Tesla designed himself when existing instruments could not do what he needed them to do. The walls were, by accounts from people who visited, covered in notes and diagrams. The workbenches were crowded with devices in various stages of construction or investigation. He worked there with the intensity he brought to every space that was genuinely his, which is to say, at all hours with complete absorption, sleeping when he had to, and stopping only when the work itself demanded it. And the work in this period was extraordinary. The Tesla coil came first, or rather it came to its mature form in this period, though the ideas behind it had been developing for years.
The Tesla coil was a resonant transformer circuit, a device that used the principle of electrical resonance to step up voltage to levels that were, by the standards of the time, almost incomprehensible. Where the transformers of the Westinghouse system worked with alternating current at relatively modest frequencies, 60 cycles per second or thereabouts, the Tesla coil operated at frequencies of hundreds of thousands of cycles per second, producing voltages of millions of volts in configurations that were physically compact enough to sit on a laboratory workbench. The effects it produced were spectacular. Arcs of electrical discharge leapt from the top of the coil in branching, luminous tendrils that looked less like anything from an engineering textbook and more like the illustrations of natural lightning, which was, in a real sense, what they were. The air around the coil glowed with the energy being pumped through it. Objects placed near the coil would light up without any physical connection to it. Light bulbs filled at a distance, tubes of gas fluorescing in colors that had no equivalent in ordinary experience. He understood the resonance principle that made this possible with an intuitive depth that went well beyond his formal mathematical treatment of it. He had a feel for resonance, for the way that systems, whether electrical or mechanical or acoustic, responded to energy applied at exactly the right frequency, absorbing it and amplifying it in ways that seemed to an observer unfamiliar with the physics almost magical. He was not unaware of the theatrical quality of what he was doing, and he was not, in this period of his life, averse to the theater.
He began giving demonstrations. Not the careful technical demonstrations of the laboratory, though those continued, but performances in the fullest sense of the word. Lectures at the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, at the Royal Institution in London, at scientific societies in Paris and other European capitals. Tesla would stand at the front of a lecture hall with his coils and his tubes and his high-frequency generators, and he would produce effects that left audiences, including audiences of professional scientists and engineers, uncertain whether to applaud or simply stare. He passed millions of volts through his own body and remained unharmed, possible at the high frequencies he was working with, where the current flows along the surface of the skin rather than through the internal organs, but visually astonishing to anyone watching. He lit fluorescent tubes by holding them near the coil with no wire, no connection, no obvious mechanism, pure electromagnetic induction at work, but appearing to the eye as something between physics and conjuring. He demonstrated wireless transmission of electrical energy across short distances, lighting lamps that had no connection to any power source in the room. The audiences were, consistently, transfixed. He was not a warm speaker in the conventional sense, not chatty or self-deprecating, or possessed of the easy humor that makes audiences relax. He was precise and serious and absolutely certain of what he was saying. And there was something in that certainty, combined with the extraordinary phenomena he was producing, that created its own kind of electricity in the room. People leaned forward. People forgot to take notes. He became, in the parlance of the 1890s, a wizard. The Wizard of Lower Fifth Avenue. In the winter of 1895, something happened in a laboratory in Germany that the scientific world received with the particular excitement reserved for genuinely unexpected discoveries. Wilhelm Röntgen, a physicist in Würzburg, had discovered a form of radiation that could pass through soft tissue and produce images of bones and internal structures on photographic plates. He called them X-rays, the X signifying the unknown, the not yet named. Within weeks, the discovery had spread across Europe and to America, producing a sensation in both the scientific community and the popular press that was almost without parallel. Tesla, working in his laboratory in New York, read about Röntgen's discovery and immediately recognized it. Not because he had made the same discovery, he had not in the sense of having documented it and published it and claimed priority, but because he had, in the course of his own experiments with high-frequency electrical discharges and vacuum tubes, observed phenomena that he now understood to be the same thing. He had noticed and set aside and made notes about effects that matched what Röntgen was describing. He had seen images of internal structures on photographic plates near his equipment. He had not understood what was causing them. Now he understood. He congratulated Röntgen generously, and then he began his own systematic investigation of X-rays, their properties, their behavior, their potential applications, and their potential hazards.
He was one of the first researchers to investigate the biological effects of X-ray exposure, and one of the first to warn, based on his own observations, that the radiation was not biologically neutral, that prolonged exposure caused damage that was real and cumulative and not to be treated casually. This warning was largely ignored by the medical community for decades, with consequences, as Tesla had suggested they might be, serious. But the X-ray investigations were, in a sense, a digression, or rather, one of the many simultaneous threads that Tesla was following in this period, in the way of a mind that could not easily confine itself to a single problem when adjacent problems were equally interesting. The thread he kept returning to, the one that had begun to consume him in the deepest way, was resonance. Not just electrical resonance, but mechanical resonance. The principle that a system vibrated at its natural frequency will absorb energy and amplify it, producing effects far beyond what the input energy alone would suggest.
He built a small mechanical oscillator, a device that produced rapid, regular vibrations, and attached it to various structures in and around his laboratory to investigate their resonant frequencies. What happened during these investigations became one of the more colorful stories in the Tesla mythology. Colorful because it involved, depending on which version you read, either minor structural vibrations in his own building or something considerably more dramatic in the surrounding neighborhood. Tesla claimed, with characteristic certainty, that he had discovered the resonant frequency of his building and that the vibrations his device produced had begun to affect it significantly, that the iron frame of the structure had begun to oscillate in a way that was alarming enough to require him to destroy his oscillator with a hammer before the building's response became uncontrollable. He claimed, in some versions of the story, that the vibrations had spread to neighboring buildings and that police had arrived before he ended the experiment. The story may be embellished. It is very much in the register of Tesla's self-presentation in this period, a presentation that was, deliberately or not, building towards something mythological. But the underlying physics was real. The principle of mechanical resonance is real. And Tesla's intuitive grasp of it was, by the testimony of the engineers who worked with him and the physicists who reviewed his work, genuinely deep. Outside the laboratory, Tesla's life in this period had an almost surreal contrast to the solitary, obsessive work he did inside it. He was a celebrated figure in New York society, one of the most sought-after dinner guests in a city that had a considerable appetite for brilliant and unusual people. He dined regularly at Delmonico's, the premier restaurant of the era, and at the homes of the wealthy and the fashionable and the intellectually ambitious. He was friendly with Mark Twain, that friendship that had begun, in a sense, in the mountains above Smiljan, when a sick young man had found unexpected joy in Twain's writing and been pulled, partly by that joy, back toward life. Twain visited the laboratory. He stood in the glow of the Tesla coil and was photographed there, looking delighted. Tesla was tall and impeccably dressed. He had strong opinions about clothes, wore them with care, and presented himself in public with a formality that was European in its precision. He was charming in company, in the particular way of very intelligent people who have decided that social performance is worth doing well. He told stories. He made observations. He was, by the accounts of people who dined with him, excellent company. And yet he kept a distance. Always, underneath the social grace, there was a remove, a sense that the person present at the dinner table was not quite the same person who worked alone at 3 in the morning in the laboratory on Fifth Avenue. He never married. He formed deep attachments to very few people. He lived in hotels rather than apartments or houses, in the impersonal, managed comfort of spaces that belonged to everyone in general and to no one in particular, which may have suited a man who did not want the anchoring weight of a home in the conventional sense. He had, he would say much later, given himself to his work entirely. There was not a great deal of himself left over for other arrangements. And then, on the night of March 13, 1895, everything he had built stopped existing. A fire broke out in the building that housed Tesla's laboratory on South Fifth Avenue. It started in the basement, in a tenant space below the floors that Tesla occupied, and it moved quickly, as fires do in buildings of that era, through the floors and up through the structure.
By the time it was controlled, Tesla's laboratory was gone. The coils, the notebooks, the instruments, the models, the years of accumulated experimental work, gone. The models for inventions that had not yet been patented, the records of experiments that had not yet been published, the physical evidence of years of exploration, all of it, ash. Tesla stood outside on Fifth Avenue and looked at what was left. He did not cry, as far as anyone recorded. He did not speak much. He went to the home of a friend and sat in silence for a long time. He had lost, in a single night, more than the fire could be expected to know it had taken. But he had not lost the one thing the fire could not reach. The ideas were still there. The vision was still there. And somewhere in that vision already forming was the next step, larger than anything he had built on Fifth Avenue, stranger, more ambitious, reaching toward a horizon that was beginning to take a very specific shape in his mind. He would build again. He just needed to find a larger space.
There are places in the world that seem to invite extremity. Colorado Springs in 1899 was one of them. Situated at the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains at an elevation of nearly 2,000 meters above sea level, it sat in a landscape of such dramatic contrast. The flat plains stretching east toward infinity, the mountains rising sharply to the west, the sky enormous in every direction, that it seemed designed for people who thought in large terms. The air was thin and clear. The light was different from any light Tesla had known in the cities of Europe or the compressed urban atmosphere of New York. And the electrical storms that rolled in from the mountains in the afternoon and evening, violent, spectacular, producing lightning strikes of a frequency and intensity that were, for an electrical engineer, essentially irresistible, were unlike anything in his experience. He came for the storms, and for the space, and for the distance from New York, which had become, in the years since the laboratory fire, a place of complications he needed temporarily to escape. He had funding, a modest but workable sum arranged partly through his friend Leonard Curtis and partly through other contacts, and he had a site on the outskirts of the town, a piece of open land large enough for the structure he intended to build. He had, as always, the vision of what he was working toward, and he had, by the spring of 1899, a hypothesis that he wanted to test, a hypothesis about the Earth itself, about the electrical properties of the planet, about what it might be possible to do if those properties were properly understood and properly used. He arrived in Colorado Springs in May of 1899 and immediately began to build. The laboratory he constructed was unlike anything that had existed before. It was, at its core, a large wooden building, roughly 20 meters on a side, with a retractable roof that could be opened to the sky, and a central mast that extended upward through the roof and could be raised to a height of more than 60 meters, topped by a large copper sphere. Inside, the main feature was a Tesla coil of unprecedented scale, a primary coil of enormous diameter, a secondary coil wound with hundreds of turns of wire, and a magnifying transmitter that Tesla had developed as the theoretical successor to the resonant transformer he had demonstrated in New York. The magnifying transmitter was the device that Tesla believed would change everything. Where the Tesla coil of the Fifth Avenue laboratory had been a demonstration instrument, spectacular and scientifically interesting, but not yet a practical power transmission device, the magnifying transmitter was designed for something specific and ambitious: to pump electrical energy into the Earth itself, using the planet as a conductor, and to demonstrate that this energy could be extracted at a distance. The Earth, Tesla had come to believe, was not merely a passive backdrop for electrical activity. It was an active participant, a spherical conductor of enormous size, capable of sustaining electrical oscillations that, if driven at the right frequency, could be made to travel around the globe and be received anywhere on its surface. If he was right, the implications were staggering. Power could be transmitted wirelessly anywhere on Earth to anyone with a receiving device. The entire infrastructure of wires and cables and poles that was being strung across the continent at enormous expense would become, in principle, unnecessary.
He was 43 years old. He was certain he was right.
The experiments began in June and continued through the summer and into the autumn. What happened in that laboratory on the outskirts of Colorado Springs in those months was witnessed by a small team of assistants, recorded in Tesla's own experimental notebook with the careful, systematic precision he always brought to serious work, and occasionally observed from a respectful distance by curious townspeople who had heard the sounds and seen the lights and were not entirely sure what to make of any of it. The sounds were remarkable. The magnifying transmitter, when operating at full power, produced a crackling discharge that could be heard miles away, a continuous explosive thunder that had no equivalent in ordinary experience. People in the town reported feeling vibrations in the ground. Animals, it was said, were disturbed. The lights were more remarkable still. When Tesla activated the transmitter at full power, the electrical discharge from the top of the mast reached toward the sky in bolts that were, by his own measurement, more than 30 meters long. The air around the laboratory glowed. St. Elmo's fire, the diffuse luminous discharge that appears on pointed conductors during electrical storms, flickered along the fences and the outbuildings. The grass in the surrounding field reportedly lit up with tiny sparks at ground level, visible in the darkness, as though the earth itself were breathing electricity. He drove iron rods into the ground at various distances from the transmitter and measured the voltages he could detect. Voltages that diminished with distance, but were measurable at distances far greater than any conventional transmission would have predicted, suggesting that the earth was indeed conducting the energy as he had theorized. He lit 200 incandescent bulbs wirelessly from a distance to demonstrate that the energy being transmitted was not just measurable, but usable. And then, one evening in late summer, he detected something. He was monitoring the signals arriving at his receiver, the instrument designed to pick up electrical oscillations from the transmitter and measure their properties. In the normal course of the experiment, what he received were the signals he sent, the transmitter's output reflected back through the earth, modified in ways he was studying. This was expected. What was not expected were signals that did not match the transmitter. Regular, rhythmic, arriving with a periodicity that was not random, not the noise of a natural phenomenon, not the random static of atmospheric electricity, but patterned. 1, 2, 3. Tesla was alone in the laboratory when it happened, or nearly alone. He sat with the receiver and listened, and the signals continued, and he felt something that he described afterward as simultaneously the most thrilling and most disorienting experience of his scientific life. He believed in that moment and for some time afterward that he was receiving signals of extraterrestrial origin, intelligent signals. The mathematics of the intervals, the regularity of the pattern, the impossibility, as he then understood it, of any known terrestrial source producing what he was detecting, all pointed, to his mind, toward a conclusion that was breathtaking in its implications. He was careful, characteristically, in how he communicated this publicly. He did not claim certainty. He described what he had observed and what he believed it might mean, and he left the larger conclusion as a hypothesis rather than a declaration. But he believed it. He wrote about it with a controlled excitement that is palpable even now, reading the notebooks. What he had most likely detected, the consensus of later analysis conducted when the technology for such analysis existed, was not signals from Mars or Venus, as Tesla speculated, but naturally occurring electrical phenomena. Atmospheric signals from distant lightning storms, Schumann resonances, the electrical noise of the Earth's own meteorological activity. The ionosphere, which was not understood in 1899, reflects and channels low-frequency electrical signals in ways that can produce the kind of regular, repeating patterns Tesla observed. The universe was not sending him a message. But the Earth was, in its own way, and what it was saying about its electrical properties was genuinely important and genuinely new. Tesla's observations of the standing waves he could produce in the Earth's electrical field, his measurements of the propagation of electrical energy through the ground, his work on the resonant frequency of the Earth itself, all of this was real science,
carefully done, pointing toward phenomena that later researchers would confirm and build upon. The Schumann resonances, the electromagnetic resonances of the Earth ionosphere cavity, are named after a German physicist who described them mathematically in 1952, 50 years after Tesla had been measuring them in a field in Colorado. He was not the first person to name the phenomenon, but he was arguably the first person to encounter it deliberately and to understand that it was real. The Colorado Springs laboratory consumed power at a rate that was, for a small electrical utility serving a small city, essentially catastrophic. Tesla had arranged for the use of power from the local electrical company, and the magnifying transmitter, when operating at full capacity, drew currents that the generating equipment was not designed to sustain. On at least one occasion, an occasion that Tesla recorded with a mixture of frustration and scientific interest, he burned out the generator that served the city of Colorado Springs entirely, leaving the town without electrical power while repairs were made. The electrical company was not pleased. Tesla paid the repair costs and continued his experiments. He was not, in this period, the easiest person to be associated with from a practical standpoint. He was convinced of the importance of what he was doing with a certainty that left little room for the kind of institutional considerations, the management of relationships, the conservation of goodwill, the maintenance of the practical infrastructure on which the work depended, that more conventionally minded people would have attended to. He was focused on the physics. The generator was a detail. He stayed in Colorado Springs for approximately 8 months. He filled 200 pages of experimental notebooks with observations, calculations, diagrams, and conclusions. He developed the theoretical framework for what he would call the World Wireless System, the global power and communications network that would become the central project of the next phase of his life. He also, in the thin, clear air of the Colorado Plateau at nearly 2,000 meters above sea level, with the Rocky Mountains to the west and the storms rolling in from them in the evenings with their spectacular electrical display, seems to have experienced something of the state he had been in before the breakdown in Budapest. That state of focused, almost mystical clarity in which the connections between phenomena became visible in a way they could not quite be made visible elsewhere. He slept little. He worked constantly. His assistants, who were capable men, found it difficult to maintain his pace and occasionally expressed concern about his health, which he dismissed with the characteristic impatience of a person who believed there were more important things to worry about. He was happy. In the driven and slightly fevered way, he was always happy when the work was going well. When he left Colorado Springs in January of 1900, he took with him something more valuable than any piece of equipment in the laboratory. He took a conviction, tested now against physical reality, refined by months of careful measurement, grounded in data that he had collected himself in conditions of extraordinary electrical intensity, that the Earth could be used as a conductor for wireless power transmission at global scale. That the vision he had been carrying in various forms since the days in Graz when Professor Poischel had explained why alternating current motors were impossible had not reached its final expression with the Niagara generators or the World's Fair illumination. Those had been the first steps, enormous steps, civilizationally significant, world-changing in the most literal sense, but steps nonetheless. What he was imagining now was something else, something that went beyond the electrification of cities or the powering of factories, something that touched on the fundamental nature of the relationship between human civilization and the planet it inhabited. Free energy, universally available, transmitted through the Earth itself, receivable anywhere by anyone without the infrastructure of wires and cables and generating stations, without, in other words, the apparatus of ownership and commerce and differential access that already, even in 1900, was beginning to shape the electrical world in ways that troubled him. He had the science, he had the data, he had the theoretical framework. He needed, now, the money to build it. And he knew, as he boarded the train back east, who he was going to ask. There are dreams that are too large for the world that contains them. Not because the dreams are wrong. Sometimes they are entirely right, pointing towards something real and possible and eventually achieved by other hands in other times. But because the gap between what is imagined and what the present moment can support, financially, technically, politically, psychologically, is simply too wide to be crossed by any single person, however gifted, however certain, however willing to sacrifice everything in the attempt. Wardenclyffe was this kind of dream, and the story of how it rose and how it fell is in many ways the central story of Nikola Tesla's life, the place where everything he was, everything he believed, everything he was willing to give, met the world's unwillingness to receive it on his terms. He came back from Colorado Springs in January of 1900 with his notebooks and his conviction and a plan that had been taking shape in his mind through all the months of experiment in that high electric landscape. The plan was this: a tower. A tall tower, built on a site within reasonable distance of New York City, equipped with a magnifying transmitter of far greater power than anything he had built in Colorado. The tower would pump electrical energy into the Earth at the resonant frequency he had measured, and that energy would be available anywhere on the surface of the planet to anyone with a receiving device simple enough and cheap enough to be universally deployed. The tower would also transmit information, text, images, voice, wirelessly to any point on the globe. It would be simultaneously a power station and a communications hub, the seed of a network that would eventually render distance meaningless and make the fundamental resources of modern civilization available to every human being, regardless of geography or wealth. He called it, in his writings, the world system. He believed, with the completeness of belief that characterized everything he committed himself to, that it would work. The Colorado Springs experiments had confirmed the key principles. The engineering was understood. What remained was the scale, the size of the transmitter needed to reach the whole planet, the height of the tower, the power of the generators, and the money to build all of it. The money was the problem. It was always, in the end, the problem. J.P. Morgan was the most powerful financier in America. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It is a statement of practical fact about the economic landscape of 1900. Morgan had reorganized the American railroad system. He had created United States Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history, by merging Carnegie Steel with a collection of other producers in a transaction of almost incomprehensible scale. He had, on 2 separate occasions, effectively rescued the United States government from financial crisis by organizing private banking consortia to stabilize the currency. He was 63 years old, physically imposing, famously intimidating in person, and in possession of a face dominated by a nose afflicted with rhinophema, which he was deeply sensitive about, that contemporary observers described in terms that ranged from striking to genuinely alarming. He was not a man who invited casual approach. Tesla approached him anyway.
The meeting was arranged through intermediaries, through the social network that Tesla had built during the years of his fame, through the connections that moved between the laboratory world and the financial world in the drawing rooms of New York's wealthy elite. Tesla prepared for it with the care he brought to important demonstrations, not a physical demonstration this time, but an argument, a vision, the most persuasive account he could construct of what Wardenclyffe would be and what it would do. Morgan listened. And Morgan, who had not become the most powerful financier in America by failing to recognize the difference between a visionary and a fraud, saw something in Tesla that interested him. Not the full vision, perhaps, not the world system in all its global, civilization-transforming ambition, but enough. Enough to make a significant financial commitment. In March of 1901, Morgan agreed to invest $150,000 in the project. In return, he received a 51% stake in Tesla's patents for radio and electrical transmission, a share that seemed, from Morgan's perspective, like reasonable security on a significant loan. Tesla accepted the terms and began immediately. He had already identified the site.
Wardenclyffe was a small community on the north shore of Long Island, quiet, rural, accessible by rail from New York City, situated on land that Tesla had determined, through his calculations, offered the right combination of geographical position, soil conductivity, and distance from urban interference for the transmitter he intended to build. He purchased 200 acres of land and commissioned the architect Stanford White, one of the most celebrated architects in America, whose firm had designed some of the most significant buildings in New York, to design the laboratory building. White produced an elegant, serious structure, a long, low brick building with generous windows and the functional grace of good industrial architecture. It was not the laboratory of a man who was being modest about his intentions. And then there was the tower. The tower was to be 62 meters tall, a wooden framework of considerable structural complexity, topped by a hemispherical copper dome 16 meters in diameter. The dome would serve as the terminal of the transmitter, the point from which the electrical energy would be broadcast into the earth below and the sky above. It was, in photographs taken during its construction, a remarkable and slightly alien-looking structure, a mushroom of copper and wood rising from the flat Long Island landscape, visible for miles, unlike anything that had been built before. Construction began in 1901 and proceeded, initially, with reasonable speed. Tesla was present constantly, supervising every detail with the comprehensive attention he gave to things that mattered completely. He lived partly on site and partly in New York, moving between the laboratory and the city with the focused urgency of a man who knows he is working against a clock whose face he cannot quite read. He also, in this period, was racing against something he had not anticipated.
In December of 1901, Guglielmo Marconi transmitted a wireless signal across the Atlantic Ocean. It was a single letter, the letter S in Morse code, transmitted from Cornwall in England and received in Newfoundland in Canada. And it was, in the context of its time, a sensation. Wireless telegraphy had been demonstrated over short distances before, but transatlantic transmission was something else. A proof that information could travel without wires across the full breadth of an ocean. That the old dream of global wireless communication was not merely theoretical. Marconi was celebrated. He became, almost overnight, the most famous wireless inventor in the world. Tesla read the reports from his laboratory on Long Island and felt a complicated mixture of emotions that he managed, in public, with considerable dignity. The complication was this. Marconi's system used patents, 17 of them, and of those 17, the foundational ones, the ones that described the essential principles of wireless transmission, were, Tesla believed, and the later history of patent litigation would eventually confirm, his. The basic architecture of Marconi's radio system derived from Tesla's work. The tuned circuits, the resonant transmission, the fundamental principles, all of it had been described and patented by Tesla years before Marconi's demonstrations. Morgan, aware of the Marconi development, wrote to Tesla with a new question. It was a simple question, and it was devastating. What, Morgan asked, does your system offer that Marconi's does not? Tesla's answer was the honest one, and it was the wrong one. He told Morgan what Wardenclyffe was really for. Not merely wireless telegraphy, not merely the transmission of information, the full vision, wireless power. Energy transmitted through the earth, available universally, without wires, without metering, without the commercial infrastructure that turned electricity into a commodity to be bought and sold. Free power. Genuinely free, not free in the sense of inexpensive, but free in the sense of available to all, beyond the reach of any commercial entity's ability to charge for it. Morgan understood immediately.
and Morgan, who had built his fortune on the commercial infrastructure of modern industrial civilization, who had invested in railroads and steel mills and electrical utilities, who had organized and profited from the monetization of exactly the kind of large-scale resources that Tesla was now proposing to make freely available, saw in Tesla's vision not a wonder, but a catastrophe. If energy could be transmitted freely to anyone on Earth, who would pay for it? The answer, of course, was nobody. That was the point. That was what Tesla was building. Morgan asked the question that has been attributed to him in various forms, "Where can I put the meter?" And whether those exact words were spoken or not, the sentiment was real, and the response it produced was real. He declined to invest further.
Tesla did not accept this immediately. He wrote to Morgan, he appealed, he adjusted his language, trying to find the framing that would allow the financier to see what he saw, the magnitude of the achievement, the historical significance of what was being built on Long Island, the ultimate commercial possibilities that a more patient or more visionary investor might find in a global wireless network, even without the power transmission component. The letters he wrote to Morgan in this period are among the most extraordinary documents in the history of American science. Detailed, urgent, alternately pleading and imperious, revealing in every line the full dimensions of Tesla's need and the full dimensions of his certainty. He was not a man who asked for things easily. He was not built for supplication. And yet, here he was, on page after page, asking, explaining, trying to make a man of commerce see what a man of science had seen. Morgan was not unmoved. He was also not changing his mind. He had made his investment. He had received his 51% stake. He was not going to put more money into a project whose ultimate goal was the elimination of the commercial infrastructure on which his other investments depended. The correspondence continued for years. Morgan's responses became shorter and more final. Tesla's became longer and more desperate. The gap between what was needed and what was available, between the cost of completing Wardenclyffe and the funds that Tesla could actually access, widened slowly, and then quickly, and then became uncrossable. Construction slowed, then stopped, then started again, briefly, when Tesla found temporary sources of funding from other investors who were smaller and less reliable than Morgan, then stopped again. The workers who had been building the tower were paid, and then not paid, and then paid again, and then not paid for long enough that they left. The laboratory building stood, elegant and serious, on its 200 acres of Long Island land with equipment inside it, and a tower outside that was neither finished nor abandoned, but simply paused, held in the particular suspension of a project that has not been officially canceled, but has run out of the resources to continue. Tesla moved between New York and Wardenclyffe, unwilling to concede that the project was dying, unable to find the resources to keep it alive. He borrowed money from friends, he sold assets, he wrote proposals and sent them to financiers who declined or did not respond. He was not building the world system anymore. He was trying to survive long enough to finish the tower. He was also, in this period, engaged in a legal battle with Marconi over the radio patents, a battle he could not afford to conduct properly against a well-funded opponent who had public acclaim and commercial success on his side. The battle would not be resolved in Tesla's favor until 1943, the year of his death, when the Supreme Court of the United States invalidated Marconi's key patents and confirmed the priority of Tesla's work. He did not live to fully appreciate the vindication.
In 1917, the United States government ordered the demolition of the Wardenclyffe Tower. The official reason was military. The tower was a potential navigation aid for enemy submarines operating in Long Island Sound, and in the context of the First World War, its continued existence was deemed a security risk. The demolition was carried out with explosives. The copper dome came down first, then the wooden framework. The tower that had been intended to send power around the world was reduced to salvageable metal and lumber, which were sold to pay some fraction of the debts that had accumulated around the project. Tesla was not there when it happened. He could not have watched it. He had borrowed heavily against the Wardenclyffe property, and the demolition, which destroyed whatever residual value the tower might have had, left him in a financial position that was, from this point on, essentially permanent. He would never again have the resources to build at the scale he imagined. He would never again have a patron of Morgan's magnitude or a project of Wardenclyffe's ambition. The tower was gone. The dream of free energy, the dream of a world where the fundamental resource of industrial civilization was available to every human being, wired into the planet itself, beyond ownership, was gone with it. What remained was Tesla himself, older now, diminished in the practical sense, in money and resources and institutional support, but not diminished in the way that mattered most. The mind was intact. The certainty was intact. The vision, even after Wardenclyffe, did not become smaller. If anything, it became larger and stranger, as visions sometimes do when they are freed from the practical constraints of attempted realization. He would continue to work. He would continue to imagine. He would file patents for devices that ranged from the plausible to the extraordinary, a bladeless turbine, a vertical takeoff aircraft, a system for photographing thoughts, a death ray that was not quite what the newspapers made it sound like, but was also not quite the nothing that his critics insisted it was. He would live, increasingly, in hotels, in the particular solitude of a man who has given everything to a single vision and found the world unwilling to meet him at the scale he required. But the tower stays. Even demolished, even gone, even reduced to salvage metal and old debt, Wardenclyffe stays in the imagination in a way that finished things do not always manage, because it was not finished, because what it was reaching for was never quite disproven, because there is something in the image of that copper dome rising from the Long Island flatland, aimed at a sky it never quite reached, that speaks to something real about what it means to want too much of the right thing. Tesla had wanted to give the world its power back, for free, without a meter. The world had said no. He never entirely accepted the answer.
There is a particular kind of falling that happens slowly, not the sudden drop, not the catastrophic collapse that announces itself with noise and witnesses and a clear before and after, but the gradual kind. The kind that happens over years, almost imperceptibly, one small loss at a time, each individual diminishment manageable enough to absorb, but accumulating year by year into a distance from what was that becomes very difficult to measure without feeling the vertigo of it. This is what happened to Nikola Tesla after Wardenclyffe. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, with the quiet persistence of water finding its level, the world that had celebrated him receded, and the world that replaced it was smaller and harder and less willing to look at him clearly. The years immediately after the tower's demolition in 1917 found Tesla in his early 60s, an age at which most men of his generation and accomplishment would have been consolidating a legacy, accepting honors, reviewing a career that had earned its rest. Tesla had the career. He did not have the rest, or the consolidation, or in any meaningful sense the honors. What he had were debts. The financial situation that had begun with the collapse of Wardenclyffe's funding had worsened consistently through the intervening years in the way of financial situations that are never addressed with sufficient resources and therefore never stabilize. He had borrowed from friends, from his associate George Scherf, who managed what remained of his business affairs with quiet loyalty for years. He had borrowed against properties and patents and future earnings that did not materialize in the amounts required to service the borrowing. He had, in short, done what people do when they believe that the next project, the next investor, the next vindication of the work will arrive in time to resolve the problem, and the problem had not been resolved. He moved in this period from hotel to hotel in New York, not the grand hotels of his celebrity years, not the Waldorf Astoria where he had once been a regular presence at the restaurant and where the management had extended him considerable credit in the expectation that it would eventually be repaid. Those days were past.
The hotels of Tesla's later years were decent but modest, the kind of places that accommodate people of reduced circumstances without requiring them to examine the reduction too directly. He lived in rooms, a bed, a desk, a window, the essential minimum. The Waldorf Astoria debt is worth pausing on because it illustrates something characteristic about the way Tesla navigated, or failed to navigate, the practical dimensions of his existence. He had accumulated a substantial bill at the Waldorf over the years of his celebrity, when the hotel had been his effective headquarters and he had entertained guests and maintained the appearance of a man at the center of things. When the bill became too large to ignore and the management pressed for payment, Tesla offered them something he believed to be worth considerably more than the amount owed. He offered them the model of his dynamic theory of gravity, a theoretical framework he had been developing for years, which he believed would supersede Einstein's general relativity and which he was convinced would eventually be recognized as one of the most significant contributions to physics in the history of the discipline. The Waldorf Astoria management declined. They wanted money. He did not have money. The theoretical framework, whatever its actual merits, and the question of its merits is genuinely complex because Tesla's later theoretical work has never been fully evaluated by mainstream physics, partly because he never published it in sufficiently complete form, was not legal tender in the city of New York. He left the Waldorf and moved somewhere smaller. The First World War arrived in 1914 and remade the world in ways that touched Tesla's work in complicated and sometimes painful ways. The war accelerated the development of wireless communications technology. Radio, which was now universally understood as the essential military communications tool, was being developed and deployed at a pace that peacetime would not have produced. And the technology being deployed was, in its fundamental architecture, Tesla's. The resonant circuits, the tuned transmitters and receivers, the principles that he had patented and demonstrated and fought for through the long legal battle with Marconi. He watched this from his hotel rooms with feelings that were, by his own account, deeply mixed. On one hand, the vindication was real. The technology worked. The world was using it at enormous scale in circumstances of extreme practical urgency. The principles he had described in the 1890s were now the foundation of a global communications infrastructure. On the other hand, they were using it under Marconi's name. Marconi was receiving the credit, the patents, the commercial income, the Nobel Prize, which was awarded to him in 1909, while Tesla received nothing. The legal battle over the radio patents was ongoing but underfunded, and Tesla lacked the resources to pursue it with the vigor that might have produced an earlier resolution. He wrote about Marconi with a precision and a barely controlled fury that was remarkable for a man who was, in other contexts, capable of considerable generosity. He was not, he was careful to say, accusing Marconi of deliberate dishonesty. He was saying, calmly and repeatedly and with increasing exasperation, that the priority of invention was his, that the record was clear, and that the failure to acknowledge it was an injustice that would eventually be corrected. He was right. It took until 1943. New York in the 1920s was, for most of its inhabitants, a place of extraordinary energy. The decade that is remembered as roaring, jazz and prohibition, and the particular feverish glamour of a city that felt itself at the center of everything, was for Tesla a quiet and increasingly solitary time. He was in his 60s and then his 70s. The social world that had once sought him out, the dinner parties at Delmonico's, the evenings with Mark Twain, the drawing rooms of the Astors and the Vanderbilts, was either gone or simply stopped extending the invitations that would have required him to maintain the wardrobe and the manner and the energy of the celebrated man he had once been. He did not entirely withdraw. He gave occasional interviews, which he prepared for carefully and conducted with a seriousness that sometimes disconcerted journalists who had come expecting the eccentric inventor of newspaper legend and found instead a man of precise and formal intelligence who had thought carefully about what he wanted to say. He filed patents. He never stopped filing patents right through the 1920s and into the 1930s for devices and systems and theoretical frameworks that ranged from the immediately practical to the genuinely visionary to the, in a few cases, very difficult to evaluate. But the interviews became less frequent. The patents were less often built. The world's interest in him had the quality of a fond memory rather than an active engagement. He was someone people had heard of, someone associated with a particular heroic period in the history of electrical technology, someone who existed now in the slightly awkward category of the living legend, celebrated in principle, largely ignored in practice.
He found his companions where he could. The pigeons were not a late-life eccentricity, as they are sometimes presented, a colorful detail added to the biography of an old man to make him seem charmingly odd. They were something more serious and more revealing than that. Tesla had always had a complicated relationship with animals, with the particular quality of their attention, which was uncomplicated by the demands and the disappointments and the various failures of mutual understanding that characterized his relationships with human beings. He had loved Macaque, the cat of his childhood, with a specificity and a gratitude that he never quite forgot. He had, throughout his life, noticed animals in a way that people who are essentially solitary sometimes do, with a quality of attention that is partly scientific and partly something warmer and less nameable. The pigeons of Bryant Park, near the hotels where he lived in the later years, became his regular company. He fed them daily, in all weathers, with a consistency and a devotion that his neighbors and the hotel staff observed with varying degrees of understanding. He knew individual birds. He noted their behaviors. He worried about them when the weather was bad. And then there was one pigeon in particular. She was white, with gray wingtips, and Tesla spoke about her in terms that he did not use for much else in his later life, terms of genuine love, uncomplicated and direct. He nursed her when she was injured. He installed special lighting in his hotel room to keep her warm. When she died, sometime in the late 1920s or early 1930s, he described the experience as a loss of the kind that reorganizes a person's interior landscape. He said that she had given him a reason to keep going during years when other reasons had become harder to identify. This is not the statement of an eccentric. It is the statement of a man who was very lonely and who had found in a small white bird with gray wingtips something that did not require him to be anything other than what he was. The money continued to diminish. There were occasional interventions, a modest pension arranged by the Yugoslav government, who had begun to take pride in their most famous son and who wanted him to end his days in something other than absolute destitution. There were gifts from friends and former associates, offered with varying degrees of tact. There was the Hotel New Yorker, which in 1933 provided Tesla with a room at a reduced rate, partly out of genuine respect for a man who had once been among the most celebrated figures in the city, and partly, perhaps, because the management understood that having Nikola Tesla as a resident was not without a certain distinction. He moved into room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker, and stayed. He was 77 years old. The 1930s were a decade of broad suffering in America, and Tesla suffered with them, though his suffering had a longer history and a more private character than the economic catastrophe of the Depression. He watched the world remake itself around technologies that he had either invented or anticipated, or both, and he watched himself become, in the public consciousness, a figure from a previous era, important historically, certainly, but belonging to the past in a way that made the present tense awkward. He gave interviews, still. Some of them were remarkable, moments when the clarity and the depth of his thinking cut through the surrounding mythology and showed the man himself, still precise, still certain, still reaching toward problems that the mainstream of science had not yet caught up to. He talked about cosmic rays. He talked about a dynamic theory of gravity that he continued to believe was more complete than Einstein's formulation, though he never published it in the form that would have allowed others to evaluate it seriously. He talked about a
a particle beam device that the newspapers called a death ray, and that Tesla preferred to describe more precisely as a teleforce device, a directed energy weapon of enormous destructive potential that he believed could make war obsolete by making attack impossible. Whether this device was theoretically sound, practically realizable, or somewhere in the complex territory between vision and fantasy, this question has never been definitively answered, partly because the relevant papers disappeared after his death, and partly because the physics involved touches on areas where the boundary between the possible and the impossible is not always clearly marked. He tried to interest various governments in it. The United States government showed limited interest. The Soviet Union sent a representative. Nothing came of any of it in his lifetime.
The Nobel Prize was never awarded to him. There were rumors in 1915 that he and Edison were to share the Nobel Prize in Physics, rumors substantial enough that both the New York Times and the London Times reported them as essentially confirmed. The prize was ultimately awarded to someone else entirely, and neither Tesla nor Edison ever received it. The reasons have never been fully explained, and the historical literature on the subject contains a range of theories: personal animosity between the two men making a shared prize politically complicated, concerns about the applied rather than purely theoretical nature of their work, committee dynamics that are, at this distance, difficult to reconstruct with confidence. Tesla did not speak about it much, at least not publicly. The silence was perhaps its own kind of comment. What the long descent ultimately produced, what all those years of diminishment and solitude and reduced circumstances and ignored patent claims and hotel rooms and pigeons actually made of the man who had once been the wizard of Lower Fifth Avenue, was not bitterness, exactly, or not only bitterness. It was something more complicated and, in its way, more admirable. It was a kind of absolute fidelity to the work itself, stripped of everything the work had once come packaged with: the fame, the money, the laboratories, the audiences, the social world, the feeling of being at the center of things. When all of that was gone, the work remained. The ideas remained. The certainty remained. He still believed in the world system, in the principles of wireless power, in the theoretical framework he had been building since Budapest. The world's failure to build Wardenclyffe had not, in his mind, disproven the idea. It had simply deferred it. Someone else would build it, someday. He was certain of this. He sat in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker, and he thought, and he wrote, and he fed his pigeons in Bryant Park, and he waited. Not with resignation, but with the particular patience of a man who has always known that the world moves more slowly than the minds that are trying to lead it. He was still waiting when the end came.
History has a way of awarding credit to the person who arrives at the right moment, rather than the person who arrived first. This is not always unjust. Timing matters, persistence matters, the ability to bring an idea to practical fruition matters in ways that pure priority of conception does not always capture. But sometimes the gap between who deserves the credit and who receives it is wide enough and well documented enough that it becomes something more than a nuance of historical interpretation. Sometimes it becomes a genuine wrong. And the story of Nikola Tesla's place in the history of radio, in the history of wireless communication broadly, is one of those cases where the wrong is clear enough that even the legal system eventually felt compelled to correct it. It just took longer than it should have. Guglielmo Marconi was a gifted and tenacious engineer. This is worth saying clearly, because the argument about patent priority does not require Marconi to be a fraud or a deliberate thief. He was neither. He was a young Italian engineer who had read widely in the existing literature on wireless transmission, which included, prominently, Tesla's published work and patents, and who had the practical intelligence and the commercial instinct to build working systems from the principles he found there, to demonstrate them publicly, to attract investment, and to scale them into a global business. He was also extremely well connected, extremely well funded, and operating in a period when the distinction between building on prior art and appropriating it was policed with considerably less rigor than the inventors whose work was being built upon would have preferred. Tesla had filed his basic radio patents in 1897. They were granted in the year 1900. They described, with the precision that characterized all of Tesla's patent work, the fundamental architecture of a wireless transmission system, the tuned circuits, the resonant transmitter and receiver, the use of multiple frequencies, the ground connection that was essential to the system's function. Marconi filed his own patents in the year 1900. His initial applications were rejected. The United States Patent Office reviewed them and concluded that they described systems already covered by Tesla's existing patents. Marconi refined his applications and resubmitted. The Patent Office, in a decision that Tesla found inexplicable and that later analysis has found difficult to justify on purely technical grounds, eventually granted Marconi's patents. Marconi proceeded to build his company, the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company, on the foundation of those patents. He attracted investment from figures including Thomas Edison and Andrew Carnegie. He established stations. He transmitted across the Atlantic. He became famous. He became wealthy. He received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1909, shared with Carl Ferdinand Braun. Tesla, who had described the principles on which Marconi's system operated before Marconi had done so, received nothing.
He sued, or rather he attempted to pursue legal remedies against the Marconi Company for patent infringement in the way of a man who believes the record is clear and the law will follow the record if properly presented with it. The legal proceedings were lengthy, expensive, and ultimately inconclusive during Tesla's lifetime. Inconclusive not because the technical case was weak, but because legal proceedings require resources to sustain, and Tesla's resources were insufficient to sustain them at the pace and scale required to reach a resolution. He wrote about the situation with a controlled precision that occasionally shaded into something raw. He was not, he always insisted, making a personal accusation against Marconi as a human being. He was making a technical and legal argument about priority. The distinction mattered to him because the distinction was real, because what was being contested was not character, but fact, and Tesla's commitment to factual accuracy was, in some ways, more fundamental to his identity than any personal grievance. But the personal dimension was there. It would have been inhuman for it not to be. He had watched another man receive credit, wealth, and the world's most prestigious scientific prize for work that rested on his foundations. He had watched this happen over years, while his own financial situation deteriorated and his ability to pursue new work diminished, and the world gradually reassigned his place in the story of electrical invention to a supporting role in someone else's narrative. It was not a small thing to absorb. The resolution came in 1943, 6 months after Tesla's death. The Supreme Court of the United States, in a case that had evolved considerably from Tesla's original legal efforts, reviewed the Marconi patents and found them invalid. The court held that the key patents, those covering the fundamental architecture of wireless transmission, had been anticipated by prior art. The prior art cited included work by Tesla, by John Stone, and by Oliver Lodge. Marconi's radio patents were voided. Tesla's priority was, in the most authoritative legal form available, confirmed. He had been dead for 6 months. He never knew. The irony is almost too complete to contemplate. The man who spent decades insisting that the record would eventually be corrected was finally corrected by a record he was no longer present to read. The relationship between Tesla and Edison is one of the most written about rivalries in the history of technology, and it has, over time, accumulated a layer of mythology that somewhat obscures the actual shape of what it was. They were not, in the way the mythology sometimes suggests, lifelong enemies engaged in continuous combat. They were, after the separation of 1885, largely separate, operating in different domains, pursuing different problems, building different things.
The war of currents had been intense and had left residue on both sides, but it was effectively concluded by the mid-1990s, and the men who had conducted it went on to other things. What persisted was a mutual awareness, the awareness of two very large objects in proximity, each affecting the other's gravitational field without necessarily being in direct contact. Edison continued, publicly, to maintain his skepticism about certain aspects of alternating current, though the practical victory of the AC system had long since made that skepticism irrelevant to anything except his personal narrative. He continued to be celebrated as the quintessential American inventor, the wizard of Menlo Park, the man of practical genius, the embodiment of the national myth that ingenuity and hard work were sufficient to transform the world.
Tesla continued to be celebrated, less consistently and less loudly, as something slightly different, the visionary, the theorist, the man whose insights were almost too large for their time. Where Edison was earthy and accessible and deliberately ordinary in his self-presentation, Tesla was European and formal and slightly otherworldly, and these qualities of self-presentation shaped how each man was received by a public that preferred its heroes recognizable. They met occasionally at public events in the years after the War of Currents. The meetings were civil, they were not warm. There was a dinner in 1917 at which both men were present, the Edison Medal Dinner, organized by the American Institute of Electrical Engineers, at which Tesla was being presented with the Edison Medal, the Institute's highest honor. The choice of award was not without a certain irony that everyone in the room was aware of and nobody quite mentioned directly. The medal bore Edison's name. It was being awarded to the man who had defeated Edison's electrical system. The man giving the introductory address, Bernard Berendt, a distinguished electrical engineer, spoke about Tesla's achievements in terms that left very little doubt about where he placed them in the history of electrical engineering. Tesla was late to the dinner. He had slipped away, as he occasionally did in this period, to feed the pigeons in Bryant Park. His colleagues found him there and brought him back to the dinner, where he received the medal with the quiet dignity that the occasion required. Edison, in his later years, made a statement about Tesla that has been quoted often enough that its exact provenance is somewhat difficult to establish. He said, or is said to have said, that Tesla's greatest failing was his tendency to work from theory rather than from systematic trial and error, and that this had led him to spend his energies on ideas that could not be practically realized. It is not a wholly unfair criticism. Some of Tesla's later work, the theoretical systems he described but never built, the devices he claimed to have conceived but never demonstrated, did have a quality of increasing abstraction, of reaching further from the demonstrable and closer to the purely imagined, that is genuinely distinguishable from the careful experimental work of his earlier years. But as a summary of the man's legacy, it is absurdly incomplete. The alternating current system, the rotating magnetic field, the Tesla coil, the polyphase motor, the contributions to radio technology, the Colorado Springs measurements, the conceptual foundations of wireless power transmission. These are not the products of a man who could not bridge theory and practice. They are among the most consequential practical achievements in the history of electrical engineering. Edison knew this. He was, whatever his faults, not a stupid man.
What the rivalry between Tesla and Edison ultimately reveals, when examined carefully, is not simply a conflict of personalities or technologies, but a conflict of two fundamentally different ideas about what invention is for. Edison believed that invention was for the market, that the measure of an invention was its commercial viability, its ability to find buyers, generate revenue, sustain the institutional infrastructure that made further invention possible. This was not a cynical position. It was a coherent and in many ways admirable one. Edison's laboratory at Menlo Park, funded by its commercial successes, produced a remarkable stream of useful devices because Edison understood that usefulness and commercial value were, in the world he inhabited, essentially the same thing. Tesla believed that invention was for humanity,
that the measure of an invention was what it gave to the largest possible number of people, that the commercial infrastructure was a means, not an end, and that when the means began to constrain the ends, the constraint was wrong rather than the vision. This was also a coherent position. It was also, in the world he inhabited, very difficult to sustain financially. The tension between these two ideas, between invention as commerce and invention as gift, did not resolve cleanly in either man's favor. Edison's commercial model produced extraordinary results and also sometimes produced the suppression of ideas that threatened existing commercial arrangements. Tesla's visionary model produced extraordinary ideas and also sometimes produced projects that could not find the practical foothold they needed to become real. The world of technology that we inhabit now contains both legacies, unresolved. The tension between them is still live. The argument about who invention is for, about who should benefit from it and on what terms, is still being conducted. Tesla lost the argument in his lifetime, in the specific sense that the world built its electrical infrastructure on the commercial model rather than the free energy model. But the argument itself has not been concluded, and the name attached to the unit of magnetic flux density, the Tesla, adopted by the International System of Units in 1960, stands in the textbooks of every physics student in the world, a quiet, permanent notation that someone was here and understood something and left it behind for the rest of us. That, at least, is not nothing.
Room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker was not a large room. It was comfortable, in the moderate way of mid-range hotel rooms in the 1930s, adequately furnished, adequately heated, with windows that looked out over the particular urban geometry of Midtown Manhattan, the streets below carrying the noise and the movement of a city that had not slowed down for the Depression and was not going to slow down for an old man in a hotel room on the 33rd floor. It was the kind of room that belongs to everyone in general and to no one in particular, which had always, as it happened, suited Tesla better than the anchored permanence of a real home. He moved in during 1933, when the hotel offered him the room at a reduced rate, and he did not leave again in any permanent sense for the remaining decade of his life. He was 77 years old when he arrived. He was 86 when he died. Those 9 years in room 3327 are the years that have produced the most mythology and the least clear understanding of who Tesla actually was in this final chapter. The mythology is easy to construct. The eccentric genius alone in his room, feeding pigeons, muttering about death rays, forgotten by the world that owed him everything. There is enough truth in this picture to make it seductive. There is also enough that it misses to make it unfair. The daily routine he maintained in these years had a monastic quality, not the monasticism of withdrawal or defeat, but the monasticism of a man who had stripped his life down to its essential structure and found, in that stripping, a kind of clarity. He rose early, he dressed carefully. The formal European precision of his appearance never quite relaxed, even in his 80s, even in reduced circumstances. He took his meals, when he took them, at the Hotel New Yorker's restaurant, where the staff knew him and where his dietary habits, which had always been eccentric and had over the decades become more so, were accommodated with the particular indulgence that institutions extend to distinguished and difficult long-term residents. The dietary habits deserve a note. Tesla had always been sensitive about food in ways that were partly hygienic, partly aesthetic, partly the expression of a nervous system that processed the world at unusual intensity. He had strong preferences and stronger aversions. In his later years, these had narrowed to a diet that was primarily vegetarian and heavily weighted toward warm milk, honey, and certain vegetable juices. He was, by most accounts, extremely thin. The leanness that had always been part of his physical presence had, in old age, become something approaching gauntness. His hands, which visitors consistently noted, were remarkable, large, precise, the hands of a man who had built things with them, still capable in their movements of a kind of deliberate exactness. After meals, he walked. He walked to Bryant Park, which was close to the hotel, and he fed the pigeons.
This was not a casual activity. He came with food he had prepared or purchased specifically for the purpose. He distributed it with care. He watched the birds with the focused attention he had always given to things he was genuinely interested in. The park regulars knew him. Children sometimes stopped to watch the tall, thin old man in the formal clothes feeding the birds with such evident seriousness. He did not particularly notice the children. He was watching the pigeons. The white pigeon with gray wingtips, the one he had written about with such unguarded feeling, was gone by this point, dead of old age or illness sometime in the late 1920s or early 1930s. Her absence was real in a way that Tesla found difficult to speak about directly, and therefore sometimes spoke about obliquely, in the way of people who have lost something whose importance they are not entirely comfortable claiming.
He replaced her in the sense that he continued to feed and observe the pigeons of Bryant Park, and in the sense that he occasionally brought injured birds back to his hotel room to nurse them. But he did not replace her in the other sense, in the sense of finding a particular bird with whom he had the same specific, mutual, undemanding relationship that she had provided. He was lonely. This is the simplest and most accurate thing that can be said about Tesla's final years, and it is the thing that the mythology of eccentric genius most consistently obscures. The loneliness was not the romantic solitude of the dedicated scientist. It was the ordinary, daily, physical loneliness of an old man in a hotel room who had outlived most of the people he had been close to, and who had, through the particular shape of his personality and his choices, never built the web of domestic connection that sustains most people through their later years. He had colleagues who visited, he had occasional friends, he had the hotel staff who treated him with respect and in some cases with genuine affection. He had the pigeons. It was not nothing, but it was not enough. He continued to give interviews. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Tesla's final decade, that the mind, even as the body became more fragile and the circumstances more reduced, maintained its capacity for precise and serious engagement with ideas. The journalists who came to interview him, and they came regularly, because Tesla at 80 was still a figure of sufficient public interest to generate column inches, left consistently with something more than they had expected. He was not confused. He was not merely reminiscing. He was thinking actively and specifically about problems that were current and problems that were not yet current, about the direction of technology, about the nature of the universe, about the social and political implications of the scientific developments he had spent his life contributing to. He gave a notable interview on his 75th birthday in 1931, in which he outlined a series of predictions about the future of technology that have, in the decades since, aged with uncomfortable accuracy. He spoke about the possibility of transmitting images wirelessly, television, which was then in its early experimental stages. He spoke about the development of more efficient energy sources. He spoke about the miniaturization of electrical components. He spoke about the future of aviation, predicting aircraft that would take off and land vertically and that would eventually be powered by systems that did not require combustion. He was not always right. Some of his predictions were too large or too strange to have materialized in recognizable form, but the ratio of accuracy to error in those late interviews is high enough to give pause, high enough to suggest that the mind doing the predicting was still operating at a level that the world around it was not always able to keep up with. He spoke, in these interviews, about peace. This is perhaps the most surprising and the most moving aspect of the late Tesla, the degree to which the man who had spent his life working with forces of enormous destructive potential had become in his final years genuinely and seriously preoccupied with the question of how to prevent war. The Teleforce device, the directed energy weapon that the newspapers called a death ray, was, in Tesla's own framing, fundamentally a peace technology. His argument was not that the weapon would be used to destroy enemies, but that its existence would make war impossible by making attack too costly to contemplate.
The logic was the logic of deterrence, which would become the organizing principle of global security in the nuclear age, though Tesla was articulating it in the 1930s before the nuclear age had arrived.
Whether the device he described was technically realizable in the form he claimed is genuinely uncertain. The papers that would have allowed a proper technical evaluation disappeared after his death, seized by the Office of Alien Property at the direction of the FBI, classified and only partially declassified in the decades since. What remains accessible suggests that some of what Tesla described was theoretically grounded, and some of it was not fully worked out. The honest answer is that we do not know exactly what he had, and we cannot know because the record is incomplete. What we do know is that he cared about peace with the specificity of a man who had seen what the technology he helped create could be used for, and who felt, in the way that serious people feel responsibility for the consequences of their gifts, some obligation to think carefully about those consequences. He turned 80 in 1936. The birthday was marked with more attention than his recent years had generally received. Newspaper stories, congratulatory messages from scientific organizations, a small gathering of the people who remained in his orbit. Yugoslavia sent greetings, various scientific institutions sent resolutions of honor. The attention was genuine, if slightly elegiac in its quality, the attention paid to a great figure who is understood to be near the end, whose importance is being acknowledged partly in anticipation of the moment when acknowledgement will take the form of obituary. Tesla received it with the formal grace he had always brought to public occasions, and then went back to his room. He was working on something. He was always working on something. The theoretical framework he called his dynamic theory of gravity was still incomplete in the publishable sense, still held in the architecture of his mind, still being refined, still not quite ready to be given to the world in the form that would allow the world to evaluate it fairly. He had been saying it was almost ready for decades. It is possible that it was always almost ready. It is possible that the incompleteness was protective, that a man who had given everything he completed to a world that had not always treated the gift with the care it deserved had learned at some level below conscious decision to keep something back, to have something that was still his, still unfinished, still alive in the specifically alive way that only unfinished things can be. In January of 1943, a maid at the Hotel New Yorker came to clean room 3327 and found the "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. Tesla had left strict instructions that he was not to be disturbed. He had left these instructions before during periods of intense work, and the staff had learned to respect them. But something, the particular quality of the silence, the number of days the sign had been there, some other small detail that the maid registered without quite articulating, made her open the door anyway. He was in the bed. He had been dead for approximately 2 days. The medical examiner would later determine the cause of death as coronary thrombosis, a heart attack, quiet and solitary in the room where he had lived for nearly a decade. He was 86 years old. On the desk, as always, there were papers, notes, the ongoing work that had never quite reached completion, that had existed in some state of permanent almost for as long as anyone who knew him could remember. The pigeons in Bryant Park were fed by someone else that morning.
The world learned of Nikola Tesla's death on the 8th of January 1943. The news traveled through the wire services with the particular speed reserved for figures of genuine historical significance. Not breaking news exactly, not the urgent interruption of ordinary broadcasting, but the kind of announcement that arrives with the weight of something that has been expected and is nonetheless felt. He had been 86 years old. He had been, for the better part of 2 decades, living in the reduced and quiet circumstances that his final years had produced. The world had not forgotten him exactly, but it had filed him in the way that living people sometimes get filed before they are gone, under the category of the already historical. Now he was historical in the final sense. The obituaries were generous. The New York Times ran a substantial tribute. Scientific organizations issued statements. Yugoslavia declared a period of national mourning. The tributes acknowledged the alternating current system, the rotating magnetic field, the contributions to radio technology, the Niagara Falls generators, the World's Fair illumination. They acknowledged a life of extraordinary scientific achievement. They were, in the main, accurate and respectful. They were also, in the way of obituaries for complicated people, somewhat incomplete. Within 48 hours of Tesla's death, agents of the Office of Alien Property arrived at the Hotel New Yorker. The Office of Alien Property was a wartime agency with broad authority to seize the assets of foreign nationals, authority that, in the context of a global war in which the technology of electrical transmission and wireless communication was of obvious strategic significance, extended to the papers and notebooks and physical equipment of a recently deceased Yugoslav-born inventor. They took everything. The papers from the desk, the notebooks from the drawers, the models and devices that were stored in the room and in a storage facility that Tesla had maintained separately. Approximately 80 trunks of material in total, the accumulated record of 60 years of experimental work, theoretical development, patent documentation, and private correspondence. The material was classified. It was evaluated initially by the Office of Scientific Research and Development, which brought in John G. Trump, a professor of electrical engineering at MIT, and, by his own assessment, one of the more qualified people available to evaluate Tesla's later theoretical work, to review what had been seized. Trump spent 3 weeks examining the documents and concluded in a report that was itself classified for many years that Tesla's papers did not contain workable descriptions of weapons systems that presented an immediate security concern, and that the theoretical material, while interesting in places, did not describe principles that were unknown to mainstream science. This assessment has been debated since, not because Trump was incompetent, but because the question of what the papers actually contained and what was done with them has never been fully resolved. Portions of the seized material were eventually returned to Tesla's family. Portions were declassified over subsequent decades, but the complete record of what was taken, what was evaluated, what was retained, and what may have disappeared in the process of government custody has never been made fully transparent. What is certain is that a significant portion of Tesla's most sensitive later work, the theoretical material he had been developing for decades, the papers related to the teleforce device, elements of the dynamic theory of gravity, entered government custody in January 1943 and did not emerge in complete and publicly accessible form. The funeral was held at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in Manhattan. It was attended by more than 2,000 people, a number that surprised some observers, given the degree to which Tesla's public profile had diminished in his final decades, and that surprised others not at all, given who he was and what he had done. The attendees included scientists, engineers, former colleagues, dignitaries from the Yugoslav government, and ordinary people who had followed his career from a distance and felt, in the way that the public sometimes feels the loss of a figure they have known only through newspapers and legend, that something irreplaceable had left the world. The eulogy was delivered by a former mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, who read it over the radio in the distinctive, slightly operatic style that LaGuardia brought to everything, and who described Tesla as one of the outstanding intellects of the world who paved the way for many of the technological developments of modern times. The body was cremated. The ashes were eventually placed in a golden sphere, a shape that Tesla himself had favored in his electrical apparatus, and installed in the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, where they remain. The estate he left behind was, in financial terms, almost nothing. There were the patents, some still active, some expired, all of them representing, in aggregate, the intellectual foundation of technologies that were, by 1943, generating enormous commercial value for companies and individuals who were not the Tesla estate. There were the papers that remained after the government seizure. There were the personal effects of a man who had lived in a hotel room for a decade, the formal clothes, the notebooks, the small collection of objects that an ascetic man accumulates over a long life. There was no house. There was no family in the conventional sense, no wife, no children, no domestic structure that would inherit and preserve and carry forward.
There were nephews and nieces in Yugoslavia who were his legal heirs and who worked, in the years after the war, to establish the museum in Belgrade that would become the primary institutional home for his legacy. And there was the legacy itself, which was, in the truest sense, the only estate that mattered. The immediate aftermath of Tesla's death produced a quiet irony that he might have appreciated had he been present to observe it. In the same year that he died, 1943, the Supreme Court of the United States issued its ruling voiding Marconi's radio patents and confirming the priority of Tesla's work in the fundamental architecture of wireless transmission. The ruling came in June, 6 months after Tesla's death in January. The legal vindication he had pursued for decades that had been denied him throughout his lifetime by the combination of insufficient resources and the particular sluggishness of legal processes arrived in the year he died, close enough to suggest that the universe has a sense of timing, if not of mercy. The ruling did not restore Tesla's fortune. There was no fortune to restore, and no mechanism by which a posthumous patent vindication produces material benefit for an estate that consists primarily of ashes in a golden sphere and the accumulated intellectual residue of a remarkable life. But it established, in the most authoritative legal record available, something that Tesla had always insisted was simply true, that he had been there first, that the architecture of the wireless world, the world that was, by 1943, carrying the signals of a global war, coordinated the movements of armies and navies across oceans, transmitting the news of human catastrophe and human courage to every corner of the planet, rested at its foundations on his work. He had known this. He had said so calmly and repeatedly for decades. Now the record said so too. He was not there to hear it, but the record does not require the subject to be present in order to be true.
Every great figure eventually becomes two people. There's the person who actually lived, who was born in a specific place, made specific choices, produced specific work, suffered specific losses, and died in a specific room on a specific January night. And there's the figure that the culture makes of them afterward, assembled from selected facts and useful omissions, shaped by the needs and anxieties and enthusiasms of the people doing the assembling, until what remains is less a human being than a symbol, a vessel for whatever the present moment needs a genius to represent. Tesla has become, in the decades since his death, one of the most thoroughly mythologized figures in the history of science. And the mythology, while not without its grounding in reality, has done something curious to the man at its center. It has made him larger and stranger and more perfectly victimized than he actually was, while simultaneously making him, in certain ways, smaller, less complicated, less interesting, less real. The rediscovery of Tesla began slowly in the years after the Second World War and accelerated dramatically in the later decades of the 20th century as the technologies he had worked on became not just commercially important but culturally central. The radio, the electrical grid, the alternating current motor. These were, by the 1950s and 1960s, simply the background of modern life, so embedded in the infrastructure of daily existence that most people had no particular reason to think about who had conceived them or how. But as the history of technology became a subject of broader cultural interest, and as the particular circumstances of Tesla's life, the conflict with Edison, the collapse of Wardenclyffe, the lonely final years, became more widely known, something began to happen in the public imagination. Tesla became a symbol. Specifically, he became the symbol of the misunderstood genius, the man ahead of his time, suppressed by commercial interests, robbed of credit by lesser men with better connections, vindicated only after his death. This narrative had genuine elements of truth in it. The Marconi patent situation was real. The financial pressures that killed Wardenclyffe were real. The Nobel Prize that never came was real. The poverty of his final years, contrasted with the commercial wealth generated by technologies he had invented, was real. But the narrative, in its fully mythologized form, required a Tesla who was purely victim and purely visionary, a man without flaws,
without failures of his own making, without the complicated mixture of brilliance and obsession and sometimes poor judgment that characterized the actual human being. And that Tesla, the perfect martyr of invention, is a fiction, however useful a fiction he is proved to be. The internet accelerated the mythology dramatically. Tesla became, in the early years of the 21st century, a phenomenon of online culture in a way that few historical scientific figures have managed. He appeared in popular webcomics that celebrated him with the breathless enthusiasm of a fan community that had found its hero. He became a reference point in arguments about intellectual property, about corporate suppression of innovation, about the relationship between genius and commerce. His name was borrowed for an electric car company, Elon Musk's Tesla Motors, founded in 2003, which gave his name a new visibility and a new association with the idea of clean energy and technological transformation that he himself would probably have found appropriate, even if the company's relationship to his actual legacy is more symbolic than technical. He became, in short, a meme, in the original sense of a cultural unit that replicates and spreads through a population, adapting to new contexts as it goes. The Tesla of internet culture is sometimes recognizable as the man who actually existed, and sometimes quite remote from him, a projected screen for ideas about genius and injustice and the courage to imagine beyond what the present moment accepts. This is not entirely a bad thing. The enthusiasm, even in its less accurate forms, has sent many people back to the primary sources, to Tesla's own writings, to the serious biographies, to the historical record that shows a man considerably more interesting than the mythology requires him to be.
What the real legacy looks like, stripped of mythology, is this. The alternating current electrical system that powers the modern world, the grid that delivers electricity to homes and hospitals and factories and data centers across the globe, is, in its fundamental architecture, Tesla's. The rotating magnetic field, the polyphase motor, the transformer-based transmission system that makes long-distance power delivery possible, these are his conceptions, his patents, his realization in working hardware. Every time a motor turns in a factory, every time a city comes alive with light at nightfall, every time the infrastructure of modern industrial civilization does what it was built to do, it is doing something that Nikola Tesla made possible. This is not a small thing. It is, arguably, one of the largest practical contributions any single individual has made to the material conditions of human life in the modern era. The contributions to wireless communication are real, legally confirmed, and foundational. The Tesla coil, which began as a laboratory instrument and became both a scientific tool and one of the most recognizable symbols of electrical experimentation, continues to be used in radio technology, in medical devices, and in physics education. The unit of magnetic flux density, the Tesla, carries his name into every physics classroom in the world, permanently embedded in the language of the discipline. The Colorado Springs measurements, the work on resonance and standing waves in the Earth's electrical field, the observations that anticipated the Schumann resonances, these are contributions that took decades to be properly understood and credited, and that have influenced fields from atmospheric physics to the study of global electrical phenomena. And then there is what he was reaching for at the end, the things he did not build, the systems he could not complete, the vision of a world in which energy and information moved freely across the planet, available to everyone, beyond the reach of commercial control. This vision was not realized. The world built its electrical infrastructure on the commercial model, with meters and bills and differential access based on geography and wealth, and that infrastructure has produced both extraordinary benefits and extraordinary inequalities that Tesla, who wanted to give the power away for free, would have found deeply troubling. But the vision itself, the idea that the resources of modern civilization should be universally available, that the technology exists to make them so, that the obstacles are not technical but political and economic, this idea has not gone away. It lives in the arguments about energy access in the developing world, in the debates about the internet as a public utility,
in the ongoing tension between the commercial model of innovation and the open source model. Tesla did not resolve these tensions, he embodied them at enormous personal cost. The real man underneath the myth was someone who loved pigeons and hated pearls and could recite Goethe from memory and designed electrical systems in his head without paper and tore up a contract worth $12 million because loyalty mattered more than money and spent 9 years in a hotel room in Manhattan working on a theory of gravity he never quite finished publishing. He was someone who saw the future so clearly that the present could not always find room for him, and who paid for that clarity in the specific currency that visionaries pay, in loneliness, in financial ruin, in the particular exhaustion of being always slightly further ahead than the world is ready to follow. He was not a saint, he was not a martyr, he was not the flawless genius of the internet mythology or the impractical dreamer of Edison's dismissal. He was a man, an extraordinary one, a man who reached, consistently and at great cost, towards something larger than himself, and who left the world, when he was done with it, undeniably different from the one he had entered.